Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 1141, The Power of Incense. There were many people who worshipped the great Buddha and other deities in all kinds of temples around the universe. The incense just kept on burning continuously, making lazy tendrils of fragrant smoke that wafted through the air. Belief was held only in the believer's eyes. When there were hundreds and thousands, or even millions of creatures who fell to their knees and burned incense in reverence, even a Buddha made from clay would become their god. Their belief made it so, and gave power to the inanimate. This was the power of incense, and it worked wonders. In the eyes of the martial artists of the upper world, the power of incense was just like the power of faith energy. A single belief might be insignificant, but with tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even hundreds of trillions of beliefs converged together, the power would become staggering. It was similar to the way in which countless streams converged into a river, and countless rivers converged into a great river, and then numerous great rivers converged into an ocean, and countless oceans would eventually flow in one direction, and become the pool of faith of the demon knight. The cultivation of the queens of the demon knight wasn't even the strongest in the entire universe. The three queens were only equivalent to world lords, but with the faith energy absorbed by the countless statues of the queens, and with the faith energy gathered from the millions of subjects worshipping them, they had the ability to defeat the supreme lords. Belief was their power, perhaps even more so than mere cultivation. As the faith energy continued to gather around Lavender's body, her aura also became increasingly powerful, and the blood-red light in her eyes developed a staggering intensity. Now, break. From the depths of the abyss, a stream of thin, blood-red light suddenly shot out from the giant sphere formed by the countless ghosts. Whoosh! Following that came the second, the third, the fourth stream of light, and then, suddenly, there were countless streams of light coming out from the sphere. The abyss had become a light show with the constant streams of blood-red light shooting off into space. Following the wails of the thousands of ghosts, an incomparably magnificent red sun appeared in the abyss. The faith energy swept through all of the ghosts like it was crushing dry weeds. The ghosts were soon disintegrated by the blood-red light. Moments later, the red sun dissipated, and Zen began to fall again with Lavender by his side. Dense faith energy circulated and slowly congealed on her body, forming a blood-red suit of armor. The shoulder guards of the armor were covered with spikes that stuck out all the way down to her back. The lower the part of her back that they reached, the longer these spikes were. The longest spike was at least 20 to 30 feet long. These two rows of spikes formed two enormous wings that occupied almost the entire space within the abyss, with Lavender in the center of them. The giant spiked wings on the back of Lavender's slender body caused a dramatic visual impact. The sight of her armored suit and the vicious spikes was quite breathtaking. At this moment, she had transformed into the deity whom millions of creatures worshipped. A supremely noble aura was being emitted from her body. Just a glance at her would make anybody feel awed. Even Zen, who had extremely powerful willpower, was no exception. He could not keep his eyes off her as she descended like a phoenix, wreathed in red light. The faith energy was actually this powerful. He was apparently shocked. As he looked at Lavender by his side, a strong sense of the unfamiliar arose in Zen's heart. It was as if Lavender had achieved a complete transformation at this moment. The truth was that this was indeed the case. After absorbing a certain amount of faith energy, Lavender had obtained divinity. Although there was a great difference between her and a true god, the aura she exuded was almost the same quality as that of a true god. Give me the spear and keep accelerating. I will help you pass through the rest of the journey as soon as possible. This will not last for long, Lavender said coldly. Why can't it last? Zen asked. Lavender sneered and said, that jerk, how could she let me keep extracting this energy from the pool of faith continuously? That explanation cleared it up for Zen. He took out the cold plum blood spear and handed it over to Lavender. After Lavender took the cold plum blood spear, she wielded it in a glittering arc and calmly said, turn around and get ready. Zen understood what Lavender wanted him to do. With a sudden twist of his body, he went upside down and his entire body curled up into a ball. At this moment, Lavender brandished her cold plum blood spear and ruthlessly hacked downwards at Zen. At the same time, Zen's body suddenly straightened as both of his feet stepped on the spear and pushed forward with an extreme force that propelled him forward at an incredible speed. Whoosh! In this instant, with the momentum gained from the cold plum blood spear shooting down at him, Zen's speed was at its limit as he surged downwards. Many supreme worlds away from the dark world, Elena had a faint smile fluttering on her face. Her 10-foot-long dress trailed behind her on the pristine ground. Behind Elena came a finely dressed man of the Demon Knight. He had silver hair, a handsome appearance, and a lean and lanky body. The biggest difference between him and a human warrior was his long, pointed ears. By the standard of the aesthetics of the Demon Knight race, whether or not one's ears were straight up was one of the most important beauty indicators. The members of the Demon Knight were mostly women, and they were usually more talented than male warriors in the group. Thus, in the various supreme worlds where the Demon Knight members existed, there were very few men who had achieved the cultivation level of a world lord. This man had a cultivation equivalent to that of a powerful world lord, and was thus considered even more accomplished and rare. Enzo. Elena's voice sounded indifferently. Yes, my queen. Enzo, the man in the fine clothes, placed his hand on his chest, waiting for the order from his queen. Seal off Lavender's pool of faith, and then send out Salvador, Vivica, Anisha, and Elspeth to head for the dark world. Elena ordered. Hearing this order, Enzo looked hesitant. But what about the board of elders? They won't say anything. Elena's face remained expressionless. As the queen of punishment, the controller of the court, who would dare to gainsay her now? Those who speak against me will join the dead, Elena added. Sealing the pool of faith was a massive taboo. This was because the three pools of faith absorbed the faith energy from the trillions of members of the Demon Knight, through the three queens' statues every second of every day. This was Lavender's source of power. Once the pool of faith was sealed, it would be impossible for Lavender to extract faith energy from her pool of faith, and the faith energy of the trillions of members would also not be able to replenish her pool of faith. The queens of the Demon Knight were not always the same. Lavender would die, and so would Elena, eventually. However, the Demon Knight would always have three queens. Once the old queens died, they would choose others to become their new queens. Strictly speaking, the three pools of faith did not belong to any single one of them. They were the most precious and prized possession of the entire Demon Knight race. Forcefully sealing a pool of faith would inevitably result in a backlash from the Board of Elders. This was trouble which Elena would have to account for. But that didn't matter. The current Board of Elders was weak and easily manipulated, and didn't have much of a binding force over Elena. The Queen of Life had maintained her silence, and more than 90% of Lavender's old supporters had been ruthlessly eliminated by Elena. Now who could contend against her? Previously, Elena hadn't chosen to seal Lavender's pool of faith because she had hoped that Lavender would use the faith energy from her pool of faith, so that she could trace her and find where she was. The faith energy could be used as a method to track Lavender and plan an attack against her. Of course Lavender knew what had been on Elena's mind. So after she had ascended to the upper world, Lavender had never even considered using her pool of faith. It had been unintentional that the golden-haired girl with the bloodline of the ancient Demon Knight race had accidentally unleashed the power of three queens, thus exposing Lavender's whereabouts. Since she had already been exposed, Lavender had no scruples anymore, and now she did her utmost to help Zen pass through the rest of the journey in the endless abyss as quickly as possible. However, the problem was that Lavender was unable to display the full power of the faith energy. Firstly, she was too far away from the pool of faith to draw on her full might. Secondly, Lavender was not in her complete form, as she was only a soul in her current existence. Without these obstacles, she would have easily assisted Zen to leave the endless abyss, and the Saint Lord of the Purple Bamboo sacred place who waited outside would have no power to stop her. Therefore, before her pool of faith was sealed, she had to seize the opportunity. Zen descended at an extremely fast speed, almost reaching terminal velocity, while Lavender followed by his side. She firmly grasped the cold plum blood spear with one hand. In the face of any potential danger that appeared in the abyss, she would be able to destroy it with one blow. Originally, it would have taken at least 4 hours to finish one lap of the endless abyss. However, with Lavender at his side to protect him and the meteoric speed at which he fell, Zen managed to pass through the 4th lap in less than an hour. There is another cave. We're not going into it. Though the treasures in the cave were also important, they now had no time to even think about them. 100,000 years ago, Lavender had obtained huge benefits in the 4th cave. Moreover, she had also planted a now extinct sacred thunder bamboo in the 4th cave. The environment in that cave was very suitable for this sacred thunder bamboo's growth. It would be a priceless find to reclaim the sacred thunder bamboo. Now that 100,000 years had passed, how many inches had the sacred thunder bamboo grown? Had it thrived and become a fantastic and magical forest of bamboo? If Zen could harvest some of the sacred shoots from the sacred thunder bamboo, he could then comprehend even the most powerful and profound mysteries of the sixth layer of the thunder law. How incredibly powerful Zen would then become. But now, Lavender wanted to help Zen quickly pass through the fifth lap since time was now against her. Perhaps with Zen's own strength, he would also have been able to pass through the fifth lap by himself. However, there was not much time left, and right now, they had to progress as fast as they could. As for the sacred thunder bamboo, they would still have a chance to obtain it after they passed the fifth lap. Whoosh! Zen swept past the fourth cave at lightning speed, like what he had done with the third one, and then he entered the fifth lap, which was the final circle of the endless abyss. Chapter 1142, A Whirlpool. The dark abyss was illuminated by strings of lightning segments intertwined with each other, which formed a single thick lightning bolt that hung in the abyss. Every time Zen touched the lightning bolt, a thunderous roar erupted from the abyss, accompanied by explosions of 30 to 40 feet wide balls of lightning. The lightning balls were terrifyingly powerful. The thunder law inside them had broken through the limit of the fifth layer, and had reached a degree which Zen couldn't understand anymore. Such was its tremendous power, that even Zen's divine weapon body found it hard to resist. However, Zen still sped downwards with gritted teeth. He had reached his speed's limit, so it was impossible for him to stop even if he wanted to. Crack! A lighting ball exploded under Zen's feet. Blazing white light erupted from the explosion and shone harshly upon Zen's eyes, followed by a huge force of impact which began to press down on him. Boom! As a result, the huge impact stopped Zen's descent, and he was sent flying high up while his whole body spun in the air. Zen soon stabilized his body after that disastrous incident, but a stream of blood flowed from the corner of his lips. "This is too dangerous," he mumbled. His eyebrows twisted into a slight frown, but he didn't look deterred in the slightest. He used the momentum of his descent to charge downwards once again. Meanwhile, Lavender was beside him and saw everything. Her usually cold face was warmed up by a faint smile as she floated behind Zen. She closed her eyes, and let her pure white arms pass through his underarms. Her sharp wings formed by the faith energy then began to bend constantly. The wings not only wrapped around her, but Zen's whole body as well. "Go on," she ordered. Whoosh! Since Zen was under Lavender's protection now, the speed of his descent suddenly increased several times. On the other hand, thick lightning strands were repeatedly triggered. The number of exploding lightning balls in the abyss also increased as violent rumbling sounds echoed throughout. Fortunately, the lightning balls couldn't penetrate the wings, no matter how powerful they were. Soon enough, they had descended all the way down, and there was no obstruction. After they passed through the area filled with thunder balls, they were next greeted by thunder spirits with their own will. The thunder spirits looked strangely adorable as they floated about in the abyss. They sometimes even let out soft cries, as if they were pets that could be adopted. But despite their cute appearances, the thunder spirits had immense powers. Back then when Lavender was still at the Spirit Supreme realm, she chose to leave the abyss because of the thunder spirits. While Lavender could already use the faith energy at that time, she could only use a small part of it. Lavender's arms wrapped around Zen as they continued descending head first, but the thunder spirits gathered together and began to launch a series of attacks. Boom, boom, boom. The thunderous crack of the turbulent lightning energy surged again, but Lavender's wings were indestructible. The thunder spirits didn't get to dodge in time, so they collapsed and disappeared in the collision. "Wow," Zen exclaimed. He suddenly thought that something was strange. The ancestral dragon had previously eaten quite a bit of the faith energy. However, Zen didn't realize how powerful the faith energy was at that time. Now, Zen finally understood. While Lavender was still only a remnant soul and her soul had only recovered about 60% as of now, normal world lords weren't a match for her if she used all of her faith energy. She was even on par with a supreme lord. But if what Lavender said just now was true, then Elena had a way to cut off her ability to extract faith energy. It looked like Lavender wouldn't be able to use her mysterious and immense power for quite some time. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. 5 minutes was all it took for Zen to pass through the fifth lap of the endless abyss, which was faster than the time it took him in the fourth lap. It didn't take much long for Zen to finally see the bottom of the abyss. From there he saw a deep, quiet valley which was surrounded by strange plants. Although there wasn't much light, the plants still looked lush. Boom, boom. As Zen fell deeper into the valley, his body suddenly twisted and then he landed firmly on the ground. At the same time, Lavender's wide wings retracted and condensed into 12 blades which neatly folded themselves on her back. They now looked like a pair of smaller wings. Is this valley the end of the endless abyss? Zen asked. He felt minuscule as he took in the quietness and his surroundings. Back then, he would always find a cave every time he circled a lap of the endless abyss. According to the rules, there should also be a cave at the end of the valley. Meanwhile, something flashed in Lavender's eyes. 2 blades on her back suddenly separated from her body, and then hacked at the plants at an extremely fast speed as they circled in the air. Numerous plants at the bottom of the valley were cut into pieces. It wasn't long before the valley became empty. Then, a small cave came into view at the valley's side. This cave was much smaller compared to the previous ones. This time, Zen kept to himself and didn't ask Lavender. It was because she had never been in this place before, so she naturally didn't know what was in the cave. After a few moments, Zen walked towards the cave. Lavender floated behind him with eyes filled with curiosity. After all, she'd never reached this cave before. Thus, she wanted to know the mysteries behind it, now that she was here with Zen. Just who was the Supreme Lord from remote ages? Why did he need to build such an underground palace? What kind of inheritance could Zen obtain? The cave was quite narrow, so Lavender's blade-like wings shrunk again into a small, spider-shaped pattern that attached itself to Lavender's back. The faith energy was completely under Lavender's control, as well as the shape it could transform into. Their slight footsteps echoed against the rocky walls as Zen led the way. Soon enough, they reached a stone house. It was clearly built by removing the inner part of the cave. Its walls were straight and there was even a stone bed inside. However, there was nothing on the stone bed except for a thick pile of dust. Perhaps the bed used to have something on it, like bed sheets. If a divine weapon wouldn't be able to withstand 100 million years of corrosion, then ordinary things would probably just degrade into a pile of dust. No matter how Zen looked the house, it was just an ordinary stone house to him. Even a warrior could build one in just a few seconds. Lavender's eyes fell on one corner of the stone house. There's a back door, she said. Zen nodded in response, and opened the door as Lavender requested. The moment Zen pushed the door open, a strong gravitational force tugged at him. Lavender felt it too, and wanted to stabilize her body and resist it at first. However, she was shocked when the force had dragged her easily through the small door. She realized that even if she borrowed the faith energy, it was useless against this strong pull. Wow, Zen exclaimed. Both of them now stood beside each other in an unknown space, which was filled with countless stars of various sizes. So many stars. Is this an illusion space? Zen asked. The magnificent stars looked like twinkling lamps as Zen marveled at them. Lavender shook her head and said, "It's not an illusion space. Our bodies were pulled inside this place, but the illusion space is just a projection. These stars seem to be different from the stars in the universe," Zen murmured as he gazed at them. He had cultivated the stellar body, which required him to observe the stars every day. Thus, he was quite familiar with them. While it was impossible for him to count all the stars in the universe, he was sure that the constellations in it weren't arranged in this way. The stars arranged themselves in an orderly manner in front of them. They looked like a huge whirlpool, which revolved around the center. Chapter 1143, Osborne. The stars before them were a complete, albeit scaled-down version of the universe. It was, quite frankly, a magnificent sight. However, Zen didn't just jump into the abyss to go through all those tests just to see stars. He reached out to grab his spirit beast bag to pull out Livingston. The puppet had been forcibly stuffed into the spirit beast bag previously, so when he got out, he immediately took in his surroundings. "Huh, you've barged into Osborne's residence," Livingston exclaimed. The puppet was someone of great origins. Both Zen's and Lavender's eyes lit up at his remark. Zen hadn't had the time to bring Livingston out lately because of all the things he had to do while in the abyss. He only found an opportunity to finally seek counsel with the puppet after reaching the bottom. He figured that asking Livingston for advice would be useful in breaking through this stage. "Oops, that's not right," Livingston said with a laugh. "The entire endless abyss is technically Osborne's residence. But this small Milky Way was constructed by me personally. It is a complete replica of our universe down to the very last star. Whatever you see here is in sync with the sky outside. Osborne used it to cultivate his transcendent divine might, star-plucking technique." Zen immediately shot Lavender a look. The sight of this Milky Way had awed them, but Livingston's revelation had now truly put them in a state of bewilderment. Star-plucking technique, transcendent divine might, Lavender repeated in wonder. The transcendent divine might was something that only a Supreme Lord could create. There might be a lot of Supreme Lords in this universe, but that number remained constant and Lavender knew just about every single one of them. However, this was the first time she had heard of the star-plucking technique. Only two kinds of transcendent divine might use the power of the stars. One was Zen's incomplete, stellar body, while the other was the dual forest of stars Thurgy, cultivated by an ogre Supreme Lord. She had never heard of a third technique. Even I do not know of this star-plucking technique, the Cyan Dragon said. Lavender shot a look at the rotating stars. The universe regards the heavens as a supreme existence. Do you know the name of the current round of heavens? Each round of heavens had its own will and its own name. The origins of this ancient yet unknown Supreme Lord was making Lavender suspicious. The universe had a constant 128 Supreme Lords. The arrival of a new Supreme Lord meant the death of another. The number always had to remain at 128, no more and no less. The boundless universe had countless grand world lords at the same cultivation level as Supreme Lords. However, there were no vacancies for the role. Until a Supreme Lord died, none of them could ever hope to be promoted to the role. This was why it was so easy to record the identities of the Supreme Lords. They were mostly a constant existence in the universe. The historical records pertaining to each Supreme Lord were meticulously recorded, from their birth to their death and the moment they ascended the role. That was why it was extremely peculiar for this certain Supreme Lord to be almost virtually unknown. It could be Osborne, the one Livingston referred to, but they had never heard of Supreme Lord Osborne before. Lavender's question confused Livingston even more. The name of the current round of heavens is naturally nature. The stars are connected and this is the Milky Way. Why do you ask this? Nature, Zen repeated, his eyes widening in surprise. Lavender's eyes flashed. She had already suspected it from the start, but Livingston's reply still surprised her slightly. Their reactions did not go unnoticed by Livingston. He had spent quite a lot of time sleeping within this puppet he had created. He now figured there might have been some changes to the universe he once knew before. It was only through infusing with Zen's life vitality jades that he was able to regain consciousness. After his awakening, he estimated that he had probably been asleep for at least 300 million years. Lavender's question about the name of the current round of heavens baffled him. His head even froze in place for a few minutes. Do you mean that the heavens already changed? He asked. Lavender nodded in response. It's cosmos now, she told him. Nature had passed through a grand era and finally collapsed. Zen, however, still held a heavenly fragment of this past era in his hands. The end of a round of heavens signaled the end of a grand era. All the living creatures in the universe were fated to die, along with the planets. It was with death that a new round of heavens began. Livingston initially thought he was only asleep for 300 million years, but in truth, the entire grand era of 3.6 billion years had already passed. He never thought it was possible for him to sleep that long. Ah, I see, no wonder the weapons I refined had all turned into scrap metal, he remarked. It didn't make any sense for the heavenly essence to completely disappear just like that. Now I know why. The heavens changed. The heavenly essence is naturally useless now. The heavenly essence could be created when a weapon refiner observed the heavenly law, and he would then seal it into a weapon. It actually meant that the weapon refiner comprehended the rules of the heavens. But once the heavens changed, then the previous round's heavenly essence would be deemed completely useless. That was why Livingston's ancient treasures had all been reduced to nothing. I didn't expect Osborne to be so capable. He actually brought me to cross over a whole grand era, Livingston said with a laugh. He looked at Zen with a trace of arrogance on his face. No wonder you young people haven't heard of me. I'll have you know, I'm the greatest weapon refiner in the entire universe. Ha ha. Zen's eyes lit up at this revelation. He had thought that the puppet was merely bragging, but now he realized that he might have been telling the truth. It was highly possible that Livingston was the greatest weapon refiner to have lived in the previous round of the heavens. Zen couldn't help but see this as a wonderful opportunity. The weapon refining workshop in the fairy palace still stood empty. If he could manage to start it up, then this puppet would be the perfect candidate to manage it. One could only imagine the kind of weapons the greatest weapon refiner could make. However, that was a discussion for later. There was still a more important matter at hand. Was Osborne a Supreme Lord of the previous round of heavens? Zen asked. Livingston nodded in confirmation before walking towards the miniature universe in front of them. He reached out to casually pick up a star and the entire galaxy revolved at a much faster speed. Zen and Lavender could only watch as a path started to form right in the middle of the Milky Way. Back then, in order to have a long lifespan, I begged Osborn to find the rarest material in the entire universe to help me create this puppet body. The price was to stay in this place and help him refine weapons for 400,000 years. This puppet body is driven by life vitality, and I am unable to absorb vitality between heaven and earth. Osborn would send me a massive amount of life vitality jades once in a while, but suddenly, the deliveries stopped. After using up the life vitality jades, Livingston was lulled into a deep slumber and the rest was history. I created this Milky Way. Osborn should have died long ago. I wonder what other treasures he left behind. Come with me, he said, beckoning them towards him. Zen couldn't help but notice the tinge of sadness in the puppet's tone. Billions of years had passed in a single dream. The world he once knew was no more and the friends he once had were all dead. Livingston was alive, but the world he knew was already dead. Zen and Lavender followed behind him into that ray of starlight within the rotating Milky Way. Chapter 1144, The Shake of the Heavens. The experience of walking along the road of stars was indescribable. Zen and Lavender could not help but size up the surrounding stars. Those countless stars were densely packed. No one knew what method Livingston had used to imprint the stars in the previous round of heavens and condense them into a star plate of this size. Similar to the stars that Zen communicated with, the sizes of these stars differed greatly from one another. Some of the stars were several dozen or even 100 times larger than a person. However, most of the stars were like tiny grains of sand, extremely tiny. As Zen walked along the road of stars, he noticed a small azure star floating beside him. It was only the size of a fingernail. Nonetheless, it was extremely beautiful as its surface seemed to be covered by a sea. It was just that it was so tiny, so Zen couldn't see its surface clearly. Other than this tiny star, there was also a fireball that was countless times larger than it. It's so beautiful, Lavender exclaimed. However, just as Zen was about to reach out and grab the azure star, Livingston at his side stopped him. There are many stars in the star plate and every single one of them is very important. They are part of the Milky Way. Thus, you can't take them away. Zen shrugged his shoulders. He let go of the small azure star and continued to walk forward. Although the road of stars didn't seem long, he realized that it was indeed very long while he was walking. Livingston's body was clattering as he led them. Thus, they were walking really slowly. It took about an hour for Zen to realize that the distance between him and the center of the Milky Way was not getting any shorter. How long will it take for us to walk like this? He asked. Well, crossing this half of the star plate at this speed will take about 2 days and 2 nights. Back then, I spent hundreds of years building the star plate, and every star was completed. Zen rolled his eyes. He did not wait for Livingston to finish speaking before he grabbed Livingston and started sprinting on the road of stars. Now he had to make the best use of his time. He must be nuts if he followed Livingston's pace. After a short while, Zen had crossed over half of the star plate and arrived at the center of the Milky Way. There was a massive sphere of light, emitting blinding scarlet rays. The sphere of light was around 10,000 feet wide. The sand-like stars that surrounded it were almost negligible. Is this the sun of the last grand era? Zen questioned as he stared at the huge ball of light. The sun was the most dazzling star in the universe. It was so bright that it made all the other stars surrounding it dim whenever it glowed. None of the stars there could outshine it. Livingston nodded and fiddled with a star on the plate. Soon after, the light of the sun gradually dimmed. It was just then that Zen noticed a hidden palace within the sun. Follow me. This palace is the core of the reincarnation plate. Osborn started cultivating here many years ago. Maybe he hasn't died yet, said Livingston. Nervousness showed on Zen's and Lavender's faces as they heard those words. It wouldn't be good for them if Osborn was still alive. No one knew what method Osborn had used to cross a grand era. Everyone knew that even a Supreme Lord would find it difficult to endure the mass extinction at the end of a grand era. Since this sort of thing had happened, it was likely that Osborn was still alive. The reincarnation plate, Lavender spoke after thinking for a moment. Livingston slightly nodded. The reincarnation plate is a space tool I made. We are currently in the reincarnation plate. The reincarnation plate is the endless abyss. It was Zen's turn to ask. Yes, you are right. Livingston smiled. Lavender and Zen finally understood that the underground palace was actually a space tool. Thus, it wasn't a wonder that they experienced a lot of odd things there. An empty palace welcomed Zen when he followed Livingston. There wasn't any sign of Supreme Lord Osborn or his remains. It had been a very long time after all. Supreme Lord Osborn's body would have turned into ashes if he really passed away here. Clang, clang, clang. Wandering around the empty palace, Livingston shook his head and said with disappointment, "Osborne, you have gone ahead of me and entered the 6 paths of reincarnation." Lavender also walked around, checking on some of the divine textures in one of the palace corner. "Are these divine textures used to control the reincarnation plate?" "Yes." Livingston nodded. "Since the plate is a space tool, does that mean we can fly away with its help?" Lavender followed up with another question. Livingston smiled at her. "Of course. The reincarnation plate that I refined is more than that. You are underestimating the #1 weapon refiner in the universe." Lavender's eyes suddenly lit up at his words. Just then, Zen's gaze fell upon a strange object floating in the air above a large throne at the side of the palace. It was similar to a headband, but also looked like a crown. It was made of neither gold nor iron. Its surface was emitting a faint golden light. The strange phenomenon of it floating in the air attracted Zen's attention. Unable to stop himself, Zen reached for the crown and asked, "What is this?" Lavender and Livingston were talking about the control over the reincarnation plate when they heard Zen's voice. Thus, they both turned their heads to him. As Lavender saw the crown, her eyes flashed. However, she immediately thought of something even before she could open her mouth. Confusion flooded her face when she subconsciously said, "Zen, don't touch that." Livingston also said, "This is strange. Why does this thing stay here?" However, Lavender was too slow. It was already too late when she stopped him. Zen's fingers already touched the crown, and before they could even get themselves ready, it suddenly started to tremble. At the same time, the round of heavens in the universe began to shake. Several tens of thousands of supreme worlds away, a supreme lord that was in a deep slumber suddenly opened his eyes. His cultivation method was very special, he cultivated by sleep. Now a new chaotic world had begun. Many supreme lords didn't waste time and began to cultivate. This supreme lord was no exception, but when he woke up, his eyes were filled with bewilderment as he looked at the sky and the stars. The round of heavens is trembling. Why is this happening? Are we going to have a new supreme lord? The supreme lord was amazed. The 128 supreme lords are all in their positions. How could there be the 129th one? It is impossible. No one can forcefully be one of us. He was not the only one to be shocked. In fact, all of the other supreme lords in the universe were looking up at the sky in confusion too. What was happening before them exceeded their scope of knowledge. There was no supreme lord in this universe at the beginning of a new grand era. Therefore, there was no one to bear the heavenly destiny. But as millions upon millions of years passed, the universe, which had suffered the mass extinction, began to give birth to new life forms. The races were slowly established and evolved in the span of hundreds of millions of years due to various reasons. Then, a competition started. There was a limit to the number of the supreme lords that bore the heavenly destiny. As the saying went, the early bird caught the worm. At this point, whoever could surpass the world lord level would be bestowed the title of supreme lord and be able to bear the heavenly destiny. Humans were at the forefront in this grand era under this new round of heavens called cosmos. Thus, humans had the highest number of supreme lords. With the supreme lords of the 3 great human forces added together, the supreme lords of other races were far from matching this number. In a perfect situation, nobody would be able to become a supreme lord anymore since there were already 128 supreme lords. Even if other martial artists surpassed the world lord level, they shouldn't be getting to the supreme lord level anymore. They would have to wait for the supreme lords to die first before they could seize their heavenly destiny and become new supreme lords. Chapter 1145, Ascending. The rules set by the heavens were perfectly ironclad. No one could ever fly in the face of them. After reaching the status of a supreme lord and bearing the heavenly destiny, one could make use of the law of causality to construct their own transcendent divine might. And apart from that, their lifespan would also be significantly extended. There were simply not enough positions available for the supreme lords. In its entirety, the universe had 100,000 supreme worlds, and every single supreme world had their own world lord. Also, there were dozens of grand world lords who ruled over some supreme worlds. That being said, there were only 128 world lords that could have the chance of bearing the heavenly destiny and becoming a supreme lord. For that very reason, whenever a supreme lord would draw his last breath, there was bound to be a fierce battle between the world lords to get their mitts on the vacant position. Be that as it might, this time, a completely unexpected exception cropped up. For some unknown reasons, an extra position for a supreme lord had suddenly appeared from out of the blue. This additional position seemed to have altered the fate of the heavens, causing it to tremble violently and bringing chaos to the rules set by the heavens. Every single one of the supreme lords had a somber look on their faces. They were clueless as to what was about to happen because they had never been in a position such as this one. What on earth could end up happening now that there was an extra position for a Supreme Lord? How did this come to be? What caused it to manifest in the universe? Just how were they supposed to take this extra position in hand? Given the fact that it went completely against the rules imposed by the heavens, it had quickly caught the attention of all the powerful figures in the universe. The relentless chaos in the heavens continued. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the endless abyss, Lavender had already walked over towards Zen's side. As her gaze was completely fixated on the shaking crown in front of her, a dreadful look appeared on her face. "This is the crown of destiny," Lavender said under her breath. "It only appears when a Supreme Lord passes away." Back in the day, Lavender had once led the Demon Knight race to have a hand in the battle for the crown of destiny. After an Orc Supreme Lord's lifespan unfortunately reached its end, the crown of destiny materialized. Lavender summoned a number of branches of the Demon Knight race, managing to successfully win the crown of destiny from all of the other races. And at the end of that, the one who bore the heavenly destiny, becoming the Supreme Lord, was none other than Supreme Lord Leroy. For that very reason, Supreme Lord Leroy had always been loyally following her since that day. As he attentively listened to Lavender's explanation, Zen seemed to be deeply interested and asked, "Then, does that mean I can become a Supreme Lord once I put on this crown of destiny right here and now?" "No, you will not," shaking her head, Lavender answered. "Those who bear the heavenly destiny have to go through the Soul Sea realm, the Spirit Supreme realm and the Spirit Transformation realm and become a World Lord first and foremost. I'm afraid your cultivation base is still much too low." The Soul Sea realm, the Spirit Supreme realm, and the Spirit Transformation realm were the three important levels before the World Lord level. The Soul Sea realm was the process of developing the Soul Sea, while the Spirit Supreme realm was the process of bringing life into the inner world. And lastly, the Spirit Transformation realm was the process of transforming into a god in the inner world. It should be worth mentioning that a Spirit Transformation realm warrior wasn't an actual god. The title of god was only with respect to the living creatures within the inner world. After a warrior reached the Spirit Transformation realm, the more lives were brought forth within the inner world, and the more powerful the strength of such lives was, the more terrifying this Spirit Transformation realm warrior's strength would turn out to be. Only after reaching the Spirit Transformation realm could one be given the title of a World Lord and receive the qualification to bear the heavenly destiny. Nodding his head in response, Zen realized that this crown of destiny seemed to be something quite astonishing. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't something that could really be of help to him given the situation they were in. "So, that means this crown of destiny is just a useless piece of trash to me right now," he cried out, sounding so disappointed. "What did you say? You dare call it a useless piece of trash?" Livingston had been left utterly dumbfounded by his statement. The heavens might have changed, but the rules for bearing the heavenly destiny still remained the same. The crown of destiny was regarded as a very important treasure for every warrior from any of the races, and yet here was Zen referring to it as useless trash. A tinge of a smile crept onto Lavender's face as she said, "Indeed, it might be of no value to you at the moment, but after you become a World Lord, I assure you that it's going to be very beneficial to you by then. What I'm dying to know right now is what's going to happen if one more Supreme Lord appears apart from the 128 current Supreme Lords." Livingston was in the dark as to what was going on with Zen and Lavender right now. It should be recognized that the crown of destiny was something that everyone would be willing to put their life on the line for. However, it couldn't dramatically give Zen an instant boost. Earlier, Elena had already made her move, making it even more difficult for them to get out of the underground palace. And there was just no way Zen would be able to continue cultivating here until he could reach the level of the World Lords and then bear the heavenly destiny and eventually become a Supreme Lord. That was obviously totally out of the question at this point. In comparison, figuring out a way to get out of the underground palace was of the utmost importance to them. However, one thing they were completely oblivious about was that all of the 128 Supreme Lords in the universe were now frantically trying to calculate the location of the Crown of Destiny. Concurrently, just outside the underground palace, every other warrior who had entered the underground palace had returned outside one by one. This expedition deep into the underground palace was quite an abundant harvest for these warriors. Apart from the second cave, they were all able to acquire good fortunes in the third and fourth caves. Sad to say, the number of casualties inside the underground palace was quite huge. All in all, more than half of the members of the Demon Knight race, the humans, and the ogres had lost their lives during the exploration. Having already received Alina's instructions, the Demon Knight Saint Lord was lying in wait for Zen and Lavender to come out of the underground palace. Never in her wildest dreams would she have thought that this trip to the underground palace would involve such a big issue. In any case, deciding on which side to pick between the two queens was such a no-brainer. Elena had already sent out Salvador, Vivica, Anisha, and Elspeth into the dark world. Although she still had some qualms regarding Elena's orders deep inside, as the Saint Lord of the Purple Bamboo Sacred Place, she was the one responsible for the well-being of the entire sacred place. Most importantly, she knew full well what the repercussions would be for going against Elena's orders. With Elena being the only authoritative figure in the Demon Knight race, it would be foolish to oppose her. As luck would have it, the only thing she had to do was to wait here and let Elena's men take care of everything. With the level of strength she had at present, she could lay waste to Lavender and Zen with such ease. However, if Lavender were to put up resistance, she would find it hard to bear the crime of killing the queen. Through the eyes of the ogre warriors inside the underground palace, the ogre Saint Lord had been watching everything the entire time. Zen was someone he couldn't stomach. At this point, he really couldn't care less what problems existed between Zen and the Demon Knight race, as he was dead set on not letting Zen go so easily. On the other hand, the Saint Lord of the human race was caught between a rock and a hard place at the moment. He was well aware that Zen was a warrior of the Mist Palace, but the situation right now had already gone out of hand, so he had no idea if he should be poking his nose into it. At the very bottom of the endless abyss, walking toward the center of the palace, Zen did as Livingston instructed. He went ahead and sat down in the middle of numerous divine textures. Learning how to control the reincarnation plate will require you to have a complete mastery of all the 3,600 divine textures. The amount of time it's going to take will rest on how well your divine texture perception is. Livingston explained, as his voice emanated from the other end of the palace. Screwing up his eyes, Zen did his best to impress the divine textures into his memory as he tried to activate them. True enough, it was just as Livingston had told him. The reincarnation plate was an enormous space tool. If he could successfully learn how to control it, then he could take advantage of it and leave this wretched place. All of these 3,600 divine textures had been passed down from the previous Grand Era. To Zen, these things were utterly unheard of, meaning to say, learning to master them would be exceptionally troublesome. So, the best he could do at the moment was to just try and wrap his mind around them as soon as he possibly could. 2 hours later, the divine textures surrounding Zen started to illuminate one by one. However, it was barely over 100 of them that had been lit up. If this continued at the current rate he was learning, it would most probably take about 72 hours before he could activate the divine textures in its entirety. But for all that, Zen increasingly became even more familiarized with the patterns of these divine textures, so much so that the speed at which he was able to activate them became much, much faster. 4 hours later, close to 300 divine textures had been illuminated. 6 hours later, he already managed to activate over 1,000 divine textures, making such a significant improvement in contrast to what he was able to accomplish in the first 4 hours. And eventually, after 8 hours of concentration, every single divine texture was now giving off such a radiant glow. At this point, Zen finally opened his eyes again. "Are you good to go?" Lavender asked, standing on the other end. Beaming her a gentle smile, Zen nodded his head in response. Then, he proceeded to raise his hands and stretch his arms up in the air. With this simple gesture, the ground began trembling all of a sudden. And in no time at all, the underground palace in its entirety was already shaking uncontrollably. At the same time, the warriors standing close to the entrance to the underground palace had been thrown off balance. They had no idea what was going on inside, but they all watched in awe as the space outside the underground palace started to collapse. The underground palace looks like it's shifting. How could this possibly happen? The endless abyss is actually moving. Only heaven knows what has caused this phenomenon. Even the 3 Saint Lords themselves had confusion written all over their faces as they feasted their eyes on this. Their attention was completely fixated on the inconceivable event that was transpiring right in front of their very eyes. The reincarnation plate was a sizable space tool. Having it under his disposal, Zen made it ascend from tens of thousands of miles deep underground. Not long after, a great chasm appeared in Auspice City right at its very center. One after the other, the houses started to cave in, and a thick cloud of dust started to form. In the end, everyone was forced to watch in disbelief as an enormous golden plate came out of the crack and floated into the air. Chapter 1146, Threat. The moment the reincarnation plate lifted off the ground, the 3 Saint Lords appeared above the Auspice City. As they looked at the plate, they couldn't help but frown. The warriors of the Dark World truly had many conjectures, Some could speculate that the huge underground palace could be some kind of space tool. When seeing such a massive magic treasure, all of them were surprised. But the three Saint Lords all belonged to different forces, so they all had different thoughts on their minds. Naturally, the Saint Lord of the Demon Knight forbade Lavender to leave. Although she was rather inwardly hesitant, she also knew that there was no other way out. If she let Lavender go, she would be implicating the entire purple bamboo sacred place. But before she could even make a move, the eyes of the Ogre Saint Lord flashed as he burst out in a cold laughter, heavenly ogre palm print. Even though the Saint Lord of a 10th grade sacred place wasn't considered a world lord, he still had the same extent of cultivation base. That in itself made him extremely powerful. The instant the Saint Lord attacked, all the vitality between heaven and earth in the sky above the Auspice City began to move in chaos. A massive palm print formed in the sky, no smaller than the reincarnation plate. In the depths of the plate, the palace surrounding Zen completely disappeared, leaving only himself and the 3,600 divine textures. From where he stood, Zen could see everything that was happening in the outside world. As the giant palm print came into view, a hint of seriousness flashed through his eyes. It would have been ideal if he could flee through the reincarnation plate. If it were to be broken, he would have no choice but to make use of the token that read, Mountain, to get back to the fairy place. But that was Zen's last resort. He firmly decided not to do it unless he didn't have any other choice. The palm print contained the power of extermination of all living things. It was the strongest attack Zen had ever seen. Even if he had a divine weapon body, that wouldn't have stopped him from disappearing into thin air under the power of the giant palm print. Although Livingston was confident in the reincarnation plate, Zen's and Lavender's expressions turned grave. Boom! After an exploding sound, the palm print suddenly covered the reincarnation plate, making it rattle and descend several dozen feet. Zen's feet were firmly rooted to the ground. Both his hands moved like shuttles as he controlled the divine textures, doing his best to stabilize the plate's height. Haha, this guy may have the cultivation base of a world lord, but that still doesn't make him qualified to break my reincarnation plate. Livingston sneered. The Ogre Saint Lord's eyes seemed to turn cautious. While the heavenly ogre palm print also drew out 70% of his strength, it still wasn't enough to break down the reincarnation plate. The Saint Lord of the Demon Knight seemed to be deep in thought. After releasing a long sigh, she gave a slight wave of her hands and a huge bow, several dozen feet long, appeared. In a flash, she grabbed the bowstring and suddenly retreated. Buzz! As she let go of the bowstring, the bow suddenly shot out an invisible arrow at the plate. Boom! Even as the plate was attacked by the invisible arrow, the plate remained as firm as ever, not budging once even as the arrow exploded on it. At the sight, the Saint Lord of the Demon Knight sighed slightly in relief. Although she didn't want to fight against Lavender, she had to. But if she still failed to break the reincarnation plate with her own strength, Elena couldn't blame her. In her heart, she actually hoped for Lavender's quick and clever escape. The three queens were highly respected by all members of the Demon Knight. While Elena had been trying to eradicate Lavender's supporters for the past few years, Lavender's queen statue was irreplaceable. So long as she wasn't dead, she would still be the queen of the Demon Knight. The two Saint Lords had already taken action. As for the Saint Lord of the human race, he had no reason to act. Zen was a member of the Alliance, after all, so all he needed to do was to stand by Zen's side. But much to his disliking, now that Zen got involved in the internal conflict of the Demon Knight, the human Saint Lord wasn't willing to meddle. If their involvement was discovered, it could trigger the breaking of the friendly relations between the Demon Knight and the Alliance. The human race's sacred place in the Dark World would have also needed to be relocated. In this case, the human Saint Lord had to consider the human race's interests first before recklessly taking action. The Ogre Saint Lord wasn't willing to give up. The tougher the plate was, the greater his interest grew. To every sacred place, this sort of space tool was supreme. Boom, 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 huge palm prints covered the plate, making the whole surface vibrate. In the end, he couldn't do anything to shatter it. A smile appeared on Zen's face. Never did he think that a reincarnation plate would be so strong as to withstand the attacks from a world lord. But in the next moment, Zen's smile disappeared as he saw Freya. The Ogre Saint Lord ceased his attacks, but Freya, clad in white clothes, floated gracefully in the air, approaching the Ogre Saint Lord. Numerous green and gray chains twined around Freya's body. She was leaning forward with her hair hanging low as if she had already fallen into a coma. "Your name is Zen, right?" A huge roar resounded through the sky in a clap of thunder, spreading into the reincarnation plate. "I have no interest in your life. That's a matter between you and the Demon Knight." Just hand over the reincarnation plate and the puppet. I can let you go. The Ogre Saint Lord proclaimed as he used his massive hand to grab hold of Freya. In the hand of the ogre, her petite frame was like a doll's. If he tightened his grip even slightly, she would be crushed to death. Witnessing the scene before him, Zen pulled a long face. If he handed over the reincarnation plate, he and Lavender would both die. It was impossible for the demon knight to just let them go. Lavender's eyes flashed as she frowned. She might not hesitate to sacrifice Freya. In her eyes, the woman was merely a human who had ascended to the upper world. She was of no significance to her. But Lavender had a good grasp of Zen's character. While Freya might not have been anyone important, Zen would never sacrifice her. Never would Zen give up his decision. And it was as expected. After Zen activated one of the divine textures, his voice transmitted from the reincarnation plate. What if I don't hand it over? Hearing this response, the Ogre Saint Lord wore a strong smile on his face. Then, two little black snakes slithered out of his sleeves. The slithery creatures extended from his wrists all the way to Freya, coiling around her body. Initially, the Ogre Saint Lord was afraid that his threat would be useless. Because Freya was merely good-looking, not as powerful nor precious as she was made out to be, Zen probably wasn't willing to hand over the reincarnation plate because of her. The consequences of not handing over the reincarnation plate is very simple. After the Ogre Saint Lord finished those words, the two little snakes coiled around Freya's white neck, spitting out slender, forked tongues. These iron snakes can make this woman suffer terrible torment, enough that she would wish for death. Zen's face turned gloomy as he stared at Freya. After a moment of pondering, he suddenly sneered. Then he said, I understand, but you seem to be the Saint Lord of a 10th grade ogre sacred place. So what? The ogre only snorted. I wonder if this 10th grade sacred place is important to you. I remember that it should be up north in the dark world. But I don't know if you'd be sad if I destroyed this 10th grade ogre sacred place. How dare you? Hearing this, the Ogre Saint Lord got furious. But with a wave of his hand, over 100 divine textures were activated. The entire reincarnation plate slowly spun before shooting to the north. The reincarnation plate was a space tool used by the Supreme Lord, with an extremely fast speed of travel. Relying on the plate, Zen managed to block the attacks of the Saint Lords. But he couldn't make his counterattack. The 3,600 divine textures didn't have such an ability. Just by relying on the enormous size of the plate and its unshakable outer shell, it was enough to set a rampage within the ogre sacred place. Boom! In a flash, the Ogre Saint Lord caught up from behind and once again placed his palm on the reincarnation plate, intending to stop Zen. Chapter 1147, Retreat. The Ogre Saint Lord had struck a terrifyingly powerful blow, but it still hadn't been able to stop the reincarnation plate. If you don't stop, I'll kill this human girl right now. The voice of the Ogre Saint Lord sounded once again. Zen snorted before replying coldly, I will flatten your sacred place if you dare kill her. Having said this, Zen acted immediately and increased the speed of the reincarnation plate. Under Zen's control, the massive reincarnation plate began to gather speed. As it flew up in the air, it caused a giant tornado that quickly swept over the place. Zen looked on in amazement as the speed of the reincarnation plate far exceeded his imagination. Flying through a supreme world usually took a long time. In order to save time, most martial artists chose to go through the Supreme World Channel. Their original location and the sacred place of the ogres were quite far apart. Even if the warriors of the Soul Sea realm made a round trip between these two places, it would still take them a long time if they didn't go through a Supreme World Channel. But now that Zen was being pursued by the Ogre Saint Lord, in less than 2 hours he saw a number of black buildings with unusual styles crop up. This was one of the biggest cities of the ogre race. Zen had already reached the territory of the ogres. He made the reincarnation plate crash downwards with an ear-splitting rumble. It plowed through the earth, dragging into existence a ditch that was hundreds of miles long and several miles wide. If one looked from the sky, it looked like a horrible scar had suddenly appeared across this large ogre city. And nobody knew how many of the ogres living in the city had died. The Ogre Saint Lord's eyes flashed as he saw this scene. This guy really acted on his words. This ogre city was only a border city and the Ogre Saint Lord wouldn't necessarily care if it was destroyed. But if this fellow were to continue destroying cities like this, and if he reached the core area of the sacred place, it was possible that he would completely destroy all the property that the Saint Lord had accumulated over the years. A deep rumble sounded again. The reincarnation plate continued to wreak havoc on the city and carried devastating disasters with it wherever it went. All the ogre martial artists in the city flew up, all of them looking at this massive plate in shock and anger. These burly ogre martial artists looked like insignificant mosquitoes in front of the reincarnation plate. They had no idea why such a catastrophe should come to them. Some of the ogre warriors even tried to fight back. But even the ogre Saint Lord couldn't shake the reincarnation plate off, and they were only capable of doing much less. The attacks of the Life and Death Realm and Soul Sea Realm warriors felt more like an itchy spot on the reincarnation plate and didn't leave the slightest trace on it. The reincarnation plate continued to crush the entire city. 10 circular movements later, it had destroyed almost half the city. Only then did it come to a grinding halt and start to float in the air. How about that? Did you change your mind? Zen's cold voice came from within the plate. The ogre Saint Lord's face hardened. To use a human girl to threaten a boy at the Soul Sea Realm had already been very embarrassing for him. The reincarnation plate was too important, otherwise, as a Saint Lord of a 10th grade sacred place, he wouldn't have done such a shameful thing. And right now, Zen was threatening him right back. Zen didn't give the ogre Saint Lord any time to think. He had strong psychological advantages over the Saint Lord, but knew that if he showed any sign of fear, he would only lead Freya to her death. The massive reincarnation plate abruptly started moving again and began to go deeper into the ogre sacred place. Countless ogre martial artists were floating in the air above the large ogre city, more than half of which Zen had destroyed. As their gazes found the reincarnation plate and then the tall, sturdy figure in the sky, they recognized the burly figure to be their Saint Lord. "It's our Saint Lord. Why didn't the Saint Lord stop the plate? Oh no, my home is ruined." The ogre Saint Lord became upset as he heard the wails of the ogre martial artists below. Hatred was etched on his face, but he was reluctant to let go of Zen. The temptation of the reincarnation plate was too great, and the secrets that the plate held were more than he had just seen. So what other choice did he have than letting him go? He had this human girl who he could threaten Zen with. But it seemed that his threat had had no effect on Zen and had instead caused him to lose a city. There might have been a lot of fatalities had the full devastating power of the reincarnation plate been unleashed. This boy was also a decisive killer. If the ogre Saint Lord continued to hesitate, then this sacred place would suffer greater losses. The number of dead or injured ogre martial artists might increase tenfold, or even 100-fold. Finally, the ogre Saint Lord gritted his teeth and took a step forward. The space law around him flashed as he crossed space to arrive in front of the reincarnation plate. Stop! The ogre Saint Lord blocked the path of the reincarnation plate. He had Freya with him. The reincarnation plate suddenly slowed down, finally coming to a stop only a few dozen feet from Freya. "Have you decided?" Zen asked coldly. "Let Freya go, and I'll consider nothing to have happened." Nothing to have happened? The ogre Saint Lord looked on in disbelief, sulking from within. His entire city had been destroyed and Zen was talking about it like it hadn't happened at all. How could he possibly say that? But he knew that he had nothing to offer in negotiation with Zen. In the end, he sighed, defeated and helpless, and he finally released his hand, causing the black chain around Freya's body to dissipate. He tapped lightly on Freya's forehead with his other hand and a black beam shot out from where he had touched her. It was only at this moment that Freya finally regained consciousness. Freya had lost consciousness the moment she had activated the divine texture which could help her to leave the endless abyss. She was completely unaware of what had happened after that. So when she saw herself in the hands of the ogre Saint Lord, her eyes widened, confused. "Let her go!" Zen's voice rang out. "Zen!" Freya turned to locate Zen, only to see a huge dazzling golden plate in front of her. She was surprised. What exactly was this enormous plate? Why did Zen's voice come from inside it? The ogre Saint Lord gritted his teeth and loosened his grip. Freya shook her shoulders, her mind filling to the brim with a lot of questions. Why would the Saint Lord of the ogre race listen to Zen? But now that she had obtained her freedom, Freya needed to get away from here as soon as possible. She pushed off the ground and broke free of the ogre Saint Lord. She then floated towards the plate. "Zen!" Freya shouted, the surprise not having worn off yet. "Come over here, below the plate," Zen said. When the reincarnation plate had been hidden deep underground, there had only been one entrance, the entrance that Supreme Lord Osborne had meticulously set up. However, once Zen took control of the reincarnation plate, he sealed off the entrance. He knew through these divine textures that there were many entrances to the reincarnation plate, and one of them was at the very bottom. The ogre Saint Lord stood on the sidelines in silence. Zen said to him rather nastily, "You, get away from here." The ogre Saint Lord's face flashed at Zen's words. He was a dignified Saint Lord. How could he tolerate a junior shouting at him like this? "You brat!" The ogre Saint Lord gritted his teeth as he spoke. I don't want to waste time listening to your nonsense. If you don't want your 10th grade sacred place to be destroyed, then move away. Zen's voice sounded again from the reincarnation plate, his tone indicating that there was no room for argument. The Ogre Saint Lord let out a long breath, but all he could do was step far away from this place. The Ogre Saint Lord had originally had a plan. If this human girl were to enter the reincarnation plate, Zen would definitely open an entrance. He could take this opportunity to travel over space and enter it. But chances of success were very slim. Moreover, this boy had a personality that told him he would definitely take revenge. If he were to fail, his 10th grade sacred place might really be destroyed. After much consideration, he chose to retreat. What he didn't know was that there was a crown of destiny in the reincarnation plate. The tremor of the heavens caused by the crown of destiny could only be felt by the 128 Supreme Lords. This crown of destiny was something that could make any world lord go crazy for it. If he had known this, he would probably have gone all out, since it was a chance to carry the heavenly destiny. Chapter 1148, Lavender's Subordinates. Freya carefully walked in an empty world. The background of the palace had disappeared. She felt like she was walking on the floor, but the ground below was now transparent, and she could clearly see the mountains and rivers far below. What a strange feeling it was. Zen, where are we? Freya asked curiously. The reincarnation plate, Zen replied. Freya's face became depressed. Zen's answer was the same as not answering. Where did this big space tool come from? Zen smiled when he saw Freya's expression. He then briefly recounted what had happened after Freya left. After listening to him, she suddenly came to a realization. So the endless abyss turns out to be a gigantic space tool. Freya's expression became filled with surprise. Space tools weren't anything rare. They were quite commonly seen in both the upper and the lower worlds, but it was simply inconceivable that the reincarnation plate was in fact a space tool which could block the full force attacks of world lords. A world lord, as the name suggested, was the lord of a world. In the entire universe, there were trillions of lives. World lords were only ranked second to supreme lords. Being coerced by Zen, the world lord had to let Freya go. For a moment, Freya didn't know how to express her complicated mix of feelings. The Ogre Saint Lord had used her to threaten Zen, but Zen didn't give up on her or run away. Instead, he had tried to think of a way to save her. When she thought about this, she felt warm in her heart. Zen had not abandoned her. Where are we going now? Freya asked after thinking for a while. Now we have to leave the dark world. If we don't leave now, I'm afraid we won't be able to leave later. Zen's expression had turned more serious. The reincarnation plate was indeed incomparably sturdy, and able to block the attacks of the Ogre Saint Lord. But there were simply too many powerhouses throughout the universe. Although the Ogre Saint Lord was as strong as a world lord, he still was not a world lord. The real world lords would be much stronger than him. And now that Lavender's identity had been exposed, Elena would lose no time to make her move. She would definitely send her men to chase down and kill Lavender. It was very likely that she would send world lords, grand world lords and even supreme lords. Those were odds that even Zen would struggle with. The situation was still very grim, and now was definitely not the time to relax or let down their guard. Where are we going after leaving the dark world? Lavender asked the same question. Zen was slightly surprised. When he thought of this, traces of hesitation appeared on his face. Should he return to the Alliance? The Alliance's 3,000 worlds would be able to accommodate him. Furthermore, he had joined the Alliance's Gauze Pavilion and possessed quite a few privileges in the Alliance. But now that both his and Lavender's identities had been exposed, would Yolanda still be able to protect him? Since Lavender was involved, the Demon Knight would never compromise. Perhaps Zen's current talent was enough to attract the attention of the Alliance, but he was, after all, only a member of the younger generation at the Soul Sea realm. No one would make an enemy of the Queen of Punishment of the Demon Knight for the sake of such a young man. There was no reason to expect the Alliance's support. It was not far-fetched to believe that Elena was willing to pay any price in order to kill Lavender. If Zen returned to the Alliance, Elena wouldn't stop until she reached her goal. The Alliance would not stop her. Whether or not Yolanda could protect Zen was, in the end, a big question. At that time, the Supreme Lords of the two races would have to face each other. That was a conflict which the Alliance might best want to avoid. Thinking of this, Zen shook his head and said, "No, we're not returning to the Alliance." "Well then, where are we going?" Lavender smiled. "Let's wait and see," Zen replied. Having heard this question twice in a row, he fell into deep thought. There was not much time to ponder over their dilemma now. The forces in the upper world were complicated, and the situation was even worse there than in the lower world. The great races didn't hate living together under the same sky, but rather, they could happily kill each other, while at the same time, coexisting peacefully in the dark world. So Zen had to reevaluate his course of action. From the very beginning, Zen's main goal had been to find his sister. Even now, he still pursued this goal. However, he had no clue as to where exactly Yan could be, as the universe was a big place. If she was not in this universe, which he had now traveled widely, where could she be? Could it be that she had already surpassed the heavens and left this universe? As Zen controlled the enormous reincarnation plate, he pondered on his next step. There was so much to consider and careful decisions to be made. The reincarnation plate sped through the sky above the dark world, passing countless cities on the way. There were cities belonging to the demon knight and those belonging to the humans. Of course, there were cities belonging to the ogres as well. Every time they passed a city, it would attract the attention of countless people. These people would stop and stare up into the sky at the magnificent spectacle that passed over their heads. No one had seen the likes of the reincarnation plate before. A few hours later, the reincarnation plate seemed to have covered the span of half of the dark world and arrived at the side of the supreme world. Even the broad passage of the supreme world could not accommodate the huge reincarnation plate. If Zen wanted to cross the supreme world, he had to force the world through. However, since the reincarnation plate was a space tool used by a supreme lord, it wasn't too difficult to accomplish that. After Zen had activated a few divine textures, the plate then rushed into deep space. As rays of incandescent light flashed on its surface, it was about to speed across space. However, just as the reincarnation plate began to fly off into deep space, a violent vibration was suddenly felt across the space tool. Boom! With this violent vibration, Freya could barely stand and fell to the transparent ground. She had such a fright that a small scream escaped her lips. Through the transparent wall, one could see that Zen had a severe look on his face, and Lavender's face had turned very pale. As for Livingston, this matter had originally had nothing to do with him. However, ever since Zen had turned on the reincarnation plate, he hadn't rested for even a moment. Livingston said curiously, "It seems that you have offended quite a few big shots." Around the reincarnation plate 4 martial artists of the Demon Knight had appeared. There were both men and women and they were all ferocious looking. Zen couldn't tell their cultivation. However, the auras radiating from them were definitely much more powerful than that of the Ogre Saint Lord. Lavender stared fixedly at the 4 people with her cold gaze. There was a faint trace of sorrow and regret in her eyes. Then, she lowered her head and said icily, "They are Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth. They used to be my subordinates." As the Queen of Killings, Lavender represented the strongest sword of the Demon Knight. The martial artists who had originally gathered around her were of course the strongest. Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth were chosen from the most talented geniuses of the Demon Knight. They had followed Lavender to grow their cultivation, and they had succeeded in reaching an impressive level. 100,000 years ago, when Lavender had explored the endless abyss, she had been accompanied by the 4 of them. At that time, they were only at the Spirit Supreme realm. Yet, they had proven their mettle. In the past, they were all juniors of the Demon Knight, but by then, Lavender had become a queen, and they became her guards. Salvador had almost sacrificed his life to protect Lavender while exploring the endless abyss. He would have gladly done so in the past. Yet, now it seemed that he was here to claim that life. 100,000 years later, the 4 had already become world lords, but their status and strength were even higher than those of normal world lords. They had held good relationships with Lavender, but now they were sent here by Elena to chase down Lavender. In fact, Elena had many powerhouses that served her, and some of them were much stronger even than these 4, but since she had chosen to send them to kill Lavender, she must be fully confident in their abilities. At the same time, Elena wanted to show off. "Lavender, these people were the closest to you, but they have chosen to betray you. What qualifications do you have to fight with me?" Elena thought to herself arrogantly. This was exactly the reason why she had sent Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth. Hearing Lavender's voice suddenly change, Zen controlled the reincarnation plate as he rapidly advanced. He turned his head and stared blankly at Lavender, seeing her pain and disappointment. However, he didn't know how to comfort her. Boom! At this moment, there was another violent vibration. One of the 4 was a martial artist in a white robe. He held a pale green long spear in his hands. With the thrust of his spear, he had nearly flipped the entire reincarnation plate over. His spear attack is so strong. Zen's eyes narrowed as he tried to control the divine textures. It was only with great difficulty that he finally managed to stabilize the reincarnation plate. Just then, Lavender said, "Let me talk to them." Zen remained silent as he activated another divine texture. Then, Lavender's voice drifted out from within the reincarnation plate. Chapter 1149, The Past. Salvador. The sound of Lavender's voice drifted out of the reincarnation plate and echoed in this space. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Salvador swung the spear in his hand and knelt down on one knee with eyes dark as ink. My queen. He was dressed in a snow-white robe and his long silvery gray hair hung behind him. His delicate face was more beautiful than the face of any of the women that accompanied him. Salvador was the only man in the group. The other three, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth, were all women. As Salvador knelt down on one knee, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth all followed suit. In the reincarnation plate, Lavender looked attentively at the four. How have you been? At Lavender's greeting, the four warriors trembled as they recalled their troublesome past. 700 years ago, a vision happened in the universe. A crack appeared in the intact heavens, a corpse fell from it and landed on the dark purple star. It was said that the corpse was the body of a true god. Countless races in the upper world were excited at the news and sent warriors to the dark purple star to investigate the corpse. The Demon Knight was no exception. Lavender sent Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth to the dark purple star too. That day, Lavender saw them off in person from her hollow hall. The four warriors would have to compete with the top warriors of the other races, but Lavender had faith in them. Together, they could defeat a Supreme Lord. While Supreme Lords seldom showed interest in these types of happenings, this mission was not that hard to the four of them. However, right after the four left, Lavender was struck with a bad feeling that made her feel ill. She could tell that something bad was about to happen, but she didn't know what exactly it was. Whenever this type of feelings came over her, she would ask Supreme Lord Leroy for counsel. But this time, Supreme Lord Leroy was still in closed-door cultivation, and she couldn't interrupt him. Right at that moment, Lavender heard the sound of chains. Then, she saw Elena appearing in front of the hollow hall. She was wearing a blue armor, the Saint Sky armor, and holding her weapon, the Saint Thunder Meteor Hammer. The Saint Sky armor and Saint Thunder Meteor Hammer were two supreme divine weapons of the Demon Knight. They both ranked top 50 in the Universe Spirit Tablet. When Lavender saw Elena armed, she immediately realized what she was up to. Instantly, the Saint-killing spear appeared in Lavender's hand. Meanwhile, ripples quivered across the surface of Lavender's pool of faith. She adopted the fighting stance and began to extract the faith energy from the pool of faith. If Lavender was in her best condition, with the help of her pool of faith and her spear, she could even kill a Supreme Lord. After all, she was the Queen of Killings, the strongest weapon of the Demon Knight. Elena didn't make a move. She kept on swaying the Saint Thunder Meteor Hammer in her hands. Strands of lightning flashes appeared like snakes around the hammer. These lightning flashes were very thin but contained the 8th layer of Thunder Law, as well as a fatal law of causality. Only those who had been hit by the Saint Thunder Meteor Hammer knew how powerful the weapon was. And those people didn't live to tell their stories. They had all been killed. Time went by. The entire hollow hall went silent. Lavender panicked as she realized that she was unable to extract the faith energy from the pool of faith. It was the first time that she had failed to do so since she had become the Queen of Killings. Did you seal my pool of faith? That is a capital offense in the Demon Knight. The Board of Elders won't let you go unpunished. Lavender threatened. Elena did not speak. She stepped towards Lavender, making crisp sounds with her sharp high-heeled boots that echoed across the hollow hall. Even though she had made a careful plan, nobody but herself would dare to bear the crime of killing the Queen. She had to be the one to do it. Why? Lavender asked in a cold voice. A faint cold light lit the tip of the spear in her hand. Without the faith energy, she couldn't defeat Elena. Elena smiled upon hearing the question. Why? Let me see. Well, the reason is simple. I just hate you. Not long after, earthquakes hit all the Demon Knight's sacred places, and the light surrounding all the statues of the Queen of Killings dimmed. The Demon Knight represented a large race in the universe. They lived in hundreds of supreme worlds. They had thousands of 10th-grade sacred places and countless forces. All the members knew that their queen was injured the moment the light from the statues dimmed. This was a great event in the Demon Knight. The replacement of the queen was almost related to the rise and fall of the race, and Lavender had only been in office for 100,000 years. Soon the Demon Knight members found that Lavender was still alive because every Lavender's statue showed a faint light that hadn't perished. The members soon found out the truth. Or maybe it was Elena who had never planned to hide the truth. The demon knight was actually controlled by the three queens. The board of elders had less influence on them. The three queens had their own followers. Soon, Lavender's subordinates were either killed or betrayed their queen. When Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth came back, they couldn't reverse the situation. 700 years had passed, and the four finally met Lavender again. But they were now her enemies. When they heard Lavender greeting them, a myriad of emotions flooded them. They used to be Lavender's subordinates and her closest friends. Yet they betrayed her. Salvador stood up slowly. A bitter smile was on his face. He didn't know how to face Lavender. His other three companions had the same feelings. After Lavender left, they had a hard life. "My queen, I apologize," Salvador said solemnly while bowing. They still loved their queen, and that love couldn't just disappear even after 700 years. They didn't want to go against Lavender. However, they couldn't disobey Elena's orders, or she would kill all of their families, relatives and friends. They couldn't afford such a miserable fate, so they had to come here. Lavender sighed heavily. She knew the four well, and she knew they must have come here for some reason. She didn't blame them at all. Elena was the queen of punishment and a cruel woman. She knew how to manipulate people. Lavender knew that Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth wouldn't betray her for their own advantage. It had to be Elena threatening them. Meanwhile, Zen narrowed his eyes and activated the reincarnation plate again. After Salvador took a bow, he moved the spear in his hand. Zen had seen the same move many times before. It was Lavender's move. She had used it when she was still a weak sword spirit, but the move was very powerful. This was the almighty spear technique, the best spear technique in the Demon Knight. Only the Queen of Killings could learn the spear technique. Back then, Lavender asked for the permission from the Board of Elders to pass on the spear technique to Salvador. When Salvador used the spear technique, his power was tens of thousands of times stronger than what Zen had witnessed before. After all, Salvador's cultivation level was now much higher than Lavender's at that time. That invisible spear strike stabbed the surface of the reincarnation plate, bursting out with a huge noise. Boom! The reincarnation plate didn't break, but its surface caved in notably. Meanwhile, the other three ran after the reincarnation plate and used their own weapons to attack it. Bang! Bang! Zen frowned and didn't say a word. He was focused on controlling the reincarnation plate, which moved forward at full speed. Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth chased after the reincarnation plate and kept moving forward attacking it. Not long after, cracks appeared on the surface of the reincarnation plate one after another. No matter how fast the reincarnation plate moved forward, it was unable to shake the four off. Crack, crack, the divine textures around Zen exploded one by one. They are too powerful. The reincarnation plate is unable to stop them, Livingston said with a bitter smile. I'm afraid it will break under their attacks. Nervousness was written all over Freya's face. She even tried to hold back her breath in order not to disturb Zen. She knew she was of little use at this moment. All she could do was keep quiet. Let me out, Lavender suddenly said. No, Zen turned her down without hesitation. Lavender's soul had recovered 60% and her sword spirit body was more powerful now. She might be able to fight a spirit transformation realm warrior, but she was unable to block a world lord's strike. The pool of faith is not sealed yet, so I can stall them for a while longer. After saying that, Lavender activated several divine textures around them. Holding the cold plum blood spear, Lavender appeared outside the reincarnation plate. As soon as she left the reincarnation plate, the huge wings formed by the faith energy spread on her back. She swung her spear and stood before Salvador. Chapter 1150, Suicide. Salvador's eyes softened as he saw Lavender, and he withdrew the long spear that he'd been holding and intending to stab her with. The four people who had been attacking the reincarnation plate paused at the same time. Lavender gently flapped her wings and descended slowly to stand behind the reincarnation plate, fixing a stoical gaze on the four people in front of her. Why did you stop? The four of them remained silent. They had been through an excruciating ordeal, having chased the incarnation plate all the way here. They had battle of contradicting emotions going in their hearts during the chase. The enormous reincarnation plate was just a buffer. They knew they could smash it. But what would happen next? Would they really kill Lavender? The four of them glanced at each other, despair filling their eyes. Lavender understood their expressions and their situation. She smiled what could only be an indifferent yet dangerous smile as she gently waved the long spear in her hands. Who will make the first move? None of the four moved. Lavender was strong enough to use faith energy but was still too weak to fight them. With their strength, they could kill her in an instant. But the four of them were stiff as statues as they flew behind the reincarnation plate. Not a single one of them charged forward. The reincarnation plate flew through space, the two sides in a strange kind of stalemate. Suddenly, ringing laughter resounded in the universe once again. Alina's voice. If you don't do it, I will. The punishment of eternal night has not been used in a long time. The faces of the four darkened at Alina's declaration. The punishment of eternal night was one of the cruelest punishments of the demon night. If Elena used it to punish them, their clans would suffer the most and die. The pain of the physical body wasn't the point. In fact, in the punishment of eternal night, the souls of their clansmen would be extracted and placed in a demon knight's soul prison, in which there was no life or death, only eternal torture. Usually, only the most sinful traitors of the demon night were punished with punishment of eternal night. But now, it was going to be used on their loved ones. I'll give you guys 5 minutes to think about it. After that, you won't have a choice. Alina's voice dripped sweetness, and it was obvious she was enjoying this moment the most. Once Alina's words had faded out, Salvador rushed towards the end of the reincarnation plate where Lavender was standing. Rays of spear intense gathered together at the spear in Lavender's hands. She used the same spear art as Salvador did, but despite the faith energy she was using, her attack had less than a tenth of the power that Salvador's had. But she did not retreat, her face betraying no emotion. Salvador threw his long spear aside as he charged towards Lavender. His entire body slammed into the cold plum blood spear she was holding. The tip of the spear drilled into his chest, passing through his back. Under the immense impact, his body slid down the spear shaft towards Lavender's side, blood flowing along the spear and falling on her hand. Lavender panicked, staring blankly at Salvador's face that was even more beautiful than a woman's. She opened her mouth, but didn't know what to say. A swooshing sound alerted her to the presence of another figure that had dashed over. Anisha. Lavender turned the spearhead as she saw this. She knew what Anisha was about to do. But Salvador gripped the spear that had pierced through his heart so forcefully that Lavender was rendered unable to move. Another swoosh sounded, and Anisha also thrust her body onto the long spear. Vivica and Elspeth followed closely behind. The four of them looked resolute. The 9'9" long cold plum blood spear was crowded with the four warriors' bodies. Lavender's jaw dropped as she stared at the four people on her spear. But she could not say a single word. Salvador then released the shaft of the cold plum blood spear, a dejected smile on his lips. He raised his head to look at Lavender, and said with sadness, "My queen. May I call you by your name?" Lavender nodded blankly. "Lavender, actually, I." A blush crept up on Salvador's beautiful face at this. He couldn't finish his sentence even after fumbling over his words for a long, long time. "Salvador likes you, my queen," Anisha, who was behind Salvador, blurted out. Although the queens of the Demon Knight held a supreme position, they were not allowed to marry anyone from the Demon Knight. This was because the throne was not allowed to be passed down to their next generation. After the queen died, a new leader would be chosen from the Demon Knight. Only the purest of the Demon Knight martial artists could be chosen to succeed to the throne. Lavender nodded blankly once again. "I got it. Do you still remember the South Heaven Ferry? We had just broken through to the life and death realm and were training at the South Heaven Ferry. I put something very interesting there. If you would go there again, I hope you will find it. May my queen soar once more. May my queen soar once again. May my queen soar once again. May my queen." Once they had finished speaking, muffled sounds came from within their bodies. They had forcefully disintegrated their inner worlds. The inner world at their level was already very rich. There were tens of thousands of lives in it as well, and there were even warriors at the life and death realm and the soul sea realm. When an inner world collapsed, it was like the collapse of the heavens in the universe. All life would go extinct. The life and death realm warriors, soul sea realm warriors, and all kinds of fierce beasts would all go extinct at the same time without a chance to resist. This was the law of the inner world. The moment their inner worlds fell apart, Vivica, Elspeth, Salvador, and Anisha stopped showing any sign of life. Lavender loosened her grip on the cold plum blood spear and retreated a few steps. The four of them were still in a standing position, their eyes wide open as they stared at her with smiles on their faces. Feeling utterly powerless, she fell to her knees with a thud. Not long after, Zen, Freya, and Livingston heard a loud howl, like an enraged female leopard that had just lost its cub. Zen retreated from the messy pile of divine textures. Now that nobody was chasing after him, he let the reincarnation plate fly freely in the universe. He opened an exit and arrived at the end of the plate. He saw Lavender sitting there alone, 4 dead powerhouses standing lifelessly before her, pierced through by the cold plum blood spear. All of these 4 had the strength to traverse the universe, and they were more powerful than many grand world lords. Even their corpses emitted a powerful aura. Zen floated over to stand silently behind Lavender. She was his sword spirit, and she had always been one. Even though he stood behind her and did not see her sorrowful expression, he could still feel her pain. The 4 of them were probably facing a death trap, already having prepared this plan in their hearts. They didn't want to kill their queen. But disobeying Alina's orders meant that they had to watch their own family members, relatives, and clans suffer in punishment of eternal night, which was something they weren't willing to see. In this kind of conflict, they could only choose to die by Lavender's spear. Only by committing suicide like this could it not be considered as disobeying Alina's will. "Lavender, get up," Zen suddenly said. She didn't move. "Get up." Lavender still did not move. So Zen began to control his sword spirit with a single thought. Thanks to this, Lavender's body started to float off the ground. She was the body of Zen's sword spirit, and he could control her on his own. But after Lavender's soul took over the sword spirit's body, it was usually controlled by her. Under Zen's control, Lavender floated in the air, looking at him, her eyes lacking the vigor they had in the past. Chapter 1151, The Despicable Queen. Lavender stared blankly at Zen. She looked like a doll without emotions. In a moment of great grief, her mind stopped working. Zen looked at her with pity. Seeing that Lavender was unable to move, with a simple thought he controlled her light sword spirit and pulled her into his embrace. With her hands hanging down, Lavender still did not move. "You didn't kill them. This is exactly what Elena wanted. Either the 4 of them would die, or you would die. This is not your fault. I will help you kill Elena. I will help you, I promise." Zen thought. "Thank you," Lavender said. "What?" Zen was stunned. A trace of gleam flashed Lavender's dazed eyes. Her mind was connected to Zen's, so she could feel his determination and decisiveness as his thoughts ran over his mind. "I won't compromise. I promise you I'll kill her," Lavender said softly. She was sad because of the death of Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth who had once been faithful to her. She had started her path as a remnant and she had put a lot of energy into becoming so strong. She would not change her mind so easily after she made a decision. When Zen saw that Lavender had recovered a little, the corner of his mouth curled up slightly. However, he continued to ask, "Who is that? Who do you talk about?" "Elena. I will kill her with my own bare hands." Lavender's voice grew louder and louder and a hint of lust for blood appeared in her eyes. Zen continued to encourage her, "Say it louder. I will kill you, Elena." Lavender kept on screaming out loud. Her voice, which was usually very melodious, turned into a high-pitched scream, just like the angry roar of a young girl. The fury in her eyes became intense as did her killing intent. Zen, on the other hand, pointed his finger at the sky full of stars, saying, "They can't hear you. You have to speak louder." Lavender wanted to keep on shouting but Zen extended a finger and pressed it on her lips. With a slight smile, he took out the roaring token, which had already been activated. "Now they can hear you." Lavender tensed up as her chest contracted. She then roared with the roaring token. As such, the entire universe was filled with a high-pitched scream. It was a declaration that resounded throughout the entire universe. "Elena, I will kill you. You will pay for this." An intense scream suddenly burst out, making all the living creatures in the universe get startled. Some fierce beasts who had yet to develop their intelligence grew so restless that they started attacking without reason. After a while, Elena's voice was heard once again. "Ha ha, you want to kill me? Lavender, do you think that you are safe? I just sent your 4 supporters to kill you. But they willingly sacrificed their lives for you. I couldn't predict they would give their lives for yours. Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth were truly faithful. But do you really think you can escape?" Lavender remained calm. She was prepared to reply with the roaring token again but Zen snatched it from her hands. "Do you remember me, jerk?" Zen said through the roaring token with a smile. "You, humph. Of course I remember you. You are just a nobody staying at Lavender's side," Elena replied. "You tried to kill me several times in the lower world. Now, do you still want to kill me?" Zen continued to ask. "Humph, you are just as insignificant as an ant. You had a chance to fly into the upper world only because you encountered Lavender's remnant soul. As Lavender would die soon, you will die with her," Elena said indifferently. In fact, Zen had made fast and great progress in his cultivation, which worried Elena. She had never seen Zen, but just as Lavender said, Zen had the fate to lead the world of chaos, and if he obtained a qualification in the illusion battlefield, then he would become the most powerful warrior of this age, which would pose a threat to her. What if I won't die? Zen suddenly asked. Before Elena could reply, Zen activated his roaring token again and said, "Then, will you admit that you're a jerk?" She had been a bit flustered and exasperated with Zen's disrespectful address to her. She was a queen after all. However, being a queen, she couldn't be bothered with the slandering of a nobody. She hadn't expected Zen to shout at her again though. The voice spreading from the ordinary roaring token would sometimes be drowned out by other voices. But Zen's roaring token was very powerful and the voice which came from it would not be drowned. Before Elena had a chance to speak, Zen continued, "After everything you have done, you have reached the lowest level possible. It doesn't matter if you are the queen of the demon knight. You are a despicable queen." Ha! Lavender, who was at the side, suddenly laughed out loud. Freya, who was in the reincarnation plate, also couldn't help but laugh. She already knew that Zen was using the roaring token, and at the same time, she was sure that the fellow who had used the roaring token countless times in the spiritual force sacred places mines was him. That was the first time Zen had used the roaring token at that time. Freya still vividly remembered the words he had uttered through the roaring token at that time when he was looking for a girl called Yan, but she didn't know if he had found her or not. Freya, Lavender and many warriors from many races in the universe were amused hearing Zen talk to Elena in such a way. Elena was the queen of the demon knight, but she was cursed by Zen without fear. They thought that Elena had disgraced the demon knight's name. Even the warriors of the demon knight couldn't help but laugh. Elena was undoubtedly the most respected queen of the demon knight, as well as their faith totem. But there were factions within the demon knight and each of the three queens had their own supporters. Now the Queen of Punishment was disliked by a considerable number of demon knight members, especially by the elders from the Board of Elders. Since its foundation, the demon knight had been ruled by three queens. The Queen of Life had always been silent and didn't meddle in anything, even when Elena planned to kill Lavender. If Elena succeeded in killing Lavender, she would take control of the whole race. The elders of the Board of Elders were already worried about this, but they did not dare say anything out of fear. They were waiting for the opportunity to revolt against Elena. Now that they heard the human warrior humiliating Elena, they thought this might be their chance. It felt like Zen was speaking for them and venting all their grudges that had been harbored for many years. Ha ha, this little fellow really has the guts. But Elena has already targeted and attacked Lavender. This guy will probably die sooner or later. How could he be so daring? Don't underestimate anyone. A bold person might not be reckless. Perhaps he really does have something powerful to rely on. I think that this guy's voice sounds exactly the same as that of the mysterious young man who had a quarrel with Supreme Lord Immortal and Supreme Lord Miles more than a year ago. If that's the case, then his roaring tokens. Those powerful warriors would surely notice and think of this matter just as Freya did. More than a year ago, a mysterious young man appeared with many roaring tokens that he used to curse Immortal. Then, he used the roaring tokens to chat with a mysterious woman. No one had figured out who that mysterious woman was. During this 1 year, she and that mysterious young man seemed to have disappeared. Afterwards, Lavender's voice suddenly resounded throughout the universe. Not long after that, the voice of the mysterious young man could be heard once more. Anyone could see that the mysterious man was Zen who spoke now, and Lavender's roaring tokens should have come from him. "Hey, young man, you have so many roaring tokens. Where did you get them?" As expected, at this time, a Supreme Lord roared out a question to Zen with a roaring token. Zen was not afraid at all. He had already provoked Elena and wasn't afraid of provoking a Supreme Lord. "It's none of your business." The Supreme Lord became infuriated at Zen's answer. "Brat, do you know who you're talking to? You are a Supreme Lord, right? So what?" Zen replied. "Since you know who I am, are you not afraid of being killed? You know I can find you through the demon knight, right?" The Supreme Lord said with a sneer. Hearing these words, Zen once again activated the roaring token and laughed arrogantly. "I can block the Queen of Punishment's chase. So even if there is one more Supreme Lord attacking me, I can still easily deal with this situation. Why do you think I would be afraid of your threats?" His words were extremely arrogant. Lavender reached out her hand to cover the roaring token while she smiled and shook her head. "All right, I'm fine now. You can put it away now." She knew that Zen had put in a lot of effort just for her sake. Chapter 1152, to the north. It was very dangerous for martial artists to expose themselves in the upper world. A single roaring token that could be used infinitely was enough to cause many Supreme Lords to fight over it. Nonetheless, Zen didn't even hesitate to transmit his voice using roaring token. He was obviously ready to throw caution to the wind. Lavender knew that Zen still had the fairy palace to rely on. However, Elena, as well as many Supreme Lords, had tailed him. Zen could easily compete with Spirit Supreme Realm powerhouses with his strength. But what if he faced those Spirit Transformation Realm martial artists? Or World Lords? Or Supreme Lords? There wouldn't be an option for Zen to retreat if that happened. He was too impulsive. He wasn't the type of person to bother about those things though. He just followed his heart regardless of how dangerous his decisions were. He was ready to pay any price. Looking at the corpses of Salvador, Anisha, Vivica, and Elspeth, he asked, how should we deal with them? Lavender sighed lightly and replied, keep their corpses for the time being. If I can return to the Demon Knight one day, I'll bury them in the Queen's tomb. One of the highest honors a martial artist of Demon Knight could get was to be buried in the Queen's tomb. Only the greatest martial artists and those who had made special contributions to the Demon Knight could be buried there. Although Lavender couldn't bury them in the tomb now, it didn't mean she wouldn't be able to do it in the future. World Lords, corpses would not rot even after 10,000 years. It wouldn't be difficult to store them away. Following Lavender's instructions, Zen carefully stored the 4 corpses. Lavender then floated at the end of the reincarnation plate and stopped before a spear. Salvador had thrown out his spear before killing himself. Now it was stuck on the surface of the reincarnation plate. This is the North Dawn spear. It was forged from the North Dawn crystal. I gave this to Salvador. I didn't expect that he still used it after such a long time, she muttered. The North Dawn spear was only a first-rank divine weapon. Although it was on the list of the spirit tablet, its rank was not high. It was ranked around 7,000th. In reality, Salvador had the ability to acquire a supreme divine weapon when he was still alive. However, he chose to stay with this spear for a long time. Lavender stretched her hand to take out the North Dawn spear. She stroked it gently, running her delicate fingers to its shaft. Not long after, a soft smile appeared on her face as she turned around and placed the spear into Zen's space ring. The reincarnation plate continued to fly deep into space. There were 100,000 supreme worlds in the universe and the deep space was all the same across it. However, as the angles were different, the arrangements of the stars were slightly different. After returning to the hall of the reincarnation plate, Lavender said, let's head north. North? Asked Zen curiously. Lavender nodded slightly. Yes. She remembered that Salvador said something to her before he killed himself. He mentioned about the South Heaven Ferry. It had been a long time ago when Lavender went to the South Heaven Ferry to train with Salvador, Anisha, Vivica, and Elspeth. Salvador's cultivation base was still low back then. He said that he would leave behind all the disputes and roam in the universe once his cultivation base developed. Where do you want to go the most? Lavender asked Salvador once. Thinking for a moment, Salvador then pointed to the sky and gestured to the most dazzling star at the South Heaven Ferry. The Northern Twilight Star. On more than one occasion, Salvador had said that his first destination once he traveled the universe would be the Northern Twilight Star. The South Heaven Ferry was located in the depths of hundreds of supreme worlds of the Demon Knight. Although Salvador mentioned the South Heaven Ferry, he never really asked Lavender to head there. Instead, his true destination was the Northern Twilight Star. He couldn't tell the truth since Elena had been keeping her eyes on him. Thus, Lavender was asking Zen to turn the reincarnation plate and head straight for Northern Twilight Star now. As Salvador, Anisha, Vivica and Elspeth were already dead, they had survived Elena's first wave of attacks. Neither Zen nor Lavender felt at ease. Elena was extremely cruel and merciless. She definitely wouldn't let them off so easily. There would certainly be even more powerful pursuers following them. Zen would need to get himself ready in advance since nobody could tell when Elena's next round of attacks happened. He was controlling the reincarnation plate, letting Freya once again enter the third and fourth caves of the Endless Abyss. Freya was getting all the treasures left behind by the Supreme Lord. There were many defensive treasures in the third cave and all sorts of rare materials for weapon refining in the fourth cave. A huge part of these materials came from the previous Grand Era and many of them had disappeared in the current Grand Era. Nonetheless, they were all extremely important in the eyes of Livingston. After the preparations were made, the token of mountain appeared in Zen's hand. To be exact, the token of mountain was not something for transmission. It did not simply transmit Zen. It was actually the fairy palace itself, or it could be said to be a projection of the fairy palace. Swish! The token glowed faintly when Zen poured a bit of his life vitality into it. At the same time, it began to twist and transform into a piece of melted wax. Finally, it transformed into a palm-sized mini fairy palace. Lavender had seen Zen use the token of mountain before. Thus, she was not surprised at all. However, at this moment, Freya and Livingston were quite curious. Livingston was wide-eyed while looking at the token. As the most powerful weapon refiner in the previous Grand Era, his life wasn't simply just about refining weapons. He had wide experience and extensive knowledge of a lot of things. Nonetheless, he did not expect Zen's token to change forms. It greatly shocked him. What is this? Livingston couldn't tell what material the token was made of. In addition to the extremely special space law, there seemed to be many types of law of causality that he had never heard before. Although the law of causality in every round of heavens was different, they were largely identical with only minor differences. It would allow Livingston to see through even the supreme divine weapons under this round of the heavens. But then, this mini fairy palace was clearly beyond his understanding. Zen gently threw the fairy palace onto the ground, and then it began to rapidly expand. In the end, the palm-sized fairy palace grew into an area 80 feet long and 80 feet wide. Compared to Zen's height, the fairy palace was still very small. For example, the walls of the fairy palace were just to Zen's chest, making it look like an artificial miniature scenic spot. Nonetheless, it was enough for Zen and the others to enter. Let's go in. After Zen finished speaking, he walked through the small door of the fairy palace and instantly disappeared. Livingston, Freya, and Lavender followed him. The instant they entered, the scenery around them underwent a tremendous change. The originally small fairy palace suddenly became incomparably tall and the towering walls rose up more than thousands of feet. Freya curiously looked around. The fairy palace was very new to her. She couldn't figure out where Zen came from. How could a Soul Sea Realm martial artist have such a fairy palace like this? This fairy palace. Livingston's face was filled with astonishment. Freya, on the other hand, couldn't contain her curiosity. She knew that the fairy palace was extraordinary but she couldn't see anything special about it. However, Livingston was different. When his gaze landed on the walls of the fairy palace, the two rays of light on his head began to flicker. Oh my goodness! Clang, clang, clang. Livingston stepped forward rapidly. It was hard to imagine how an old puppet could move so fast. Then, he threw himself onto a wall, stretched out his claw and gently drew a line on the cyan brick. The brick was not very sturdy. As Livingston scratched it with his claw made of metal, a shallow groove was left. Surprisingly, a moment later, the groove started to wiggle and return to normal. This is a cyan brick made of light piece sand. Excitement was flooding Livingston's face. He took 2 steps back, looked at the wall which was thousands of feet tall, and exclaimed with even more excitement, the whole wall is made of light piece sand. Freya asked curiously, what is light piece sand? In her eyes, this was just an ordinary cyan brick. It is the best material. That is impossible. I dare say no one is able to gather so much light piece sand throughout the universe. Ha, I'm going crazy. Livingston seemed to be unable to control his emotions. Chapter 1153, Unconvinced. Livingston threw himself crazily onto the cyan brick, as if he had met his most beloved lover after a long absence. After lying on the ground for a short while, his gaze shifted to the wide open space in the fairy palace. Clank, clank. He then lay down on the ground again and began to carefully observe the details on the floor which was over 100 feet in length and width. No way. After a while, he let out a high-pitched shriek of excitement. Immediately afterwards, he used his claw to carefully tap on the floor and shouted in disbelief, "This is Emperor Vigor Stone, a genuine Emperor Vigor Stone. All my life, I've only seen a piece of Emperor Vigor Stone once, and it was only palm-sized." Livingston had enjoyed an exceptionally long lifespan, even longer than those of some of the Supreme Lords. Just as the puppet had said, the Emperor Vigor Stone was indeed extremely rare. However, the floor of the fairy palace, which was as huge as a plaza, was completely inlaid with the priceless Emperor Vigor stones. It did seem extremely exaggerated. A hint of a smile flashed onto Zen's face as he watched Livingston's crazed performance while the puppet continued to admire the stones. It seemed that Zen had found a knowledgeable fellow this time. Zen had known that the fairy palace was extraordinary, but he hadn't truly noticed the floor and walls before. He would also never have thought that the materials needed to build the fairy palace would be so rare. It gave him quite a shock to discover this. Just then, Saul appeared. He greeted Zen with a slight bow. Then he smiled warmly and said, "Master, you've returned. Zen had previously obtained 3 tokens and had acknowledged the first master of the fairy palace as his master, so he was now considered to be a half-master of the fairy palace. Before Zen could reply to Saul's greeting, Livingston rushed forwards. "Are you a puppet?" Livingston crawled all over Saul as he looked him up and down, sometimes tapping on Saul's legs and sometimes tapping on his chest. "You are really a puppet. Heavens, I didn't ever believe it possible for someone to be able to make such a perfect puppet." Livingston was very proud of his skills in weapon refining, but he didn't hold a candle to the creator of Saul. Although the puppet that Livingston had made for himself was ugly, it contained an incomparably perfect life law within it. This was also the reason why his soul had been able to live until now without withering over time. In Livingston's eyes, except for him, there had probably never been anyone else in the world who could achieve such a remarkable accomplishment. However, now that he saw Saul's puppet body, Livingston finally understood what it meant to have met his match, or perhaps his peer. His own puppet body was simply insignificant when compared to Saul's. Saul looked at Livingston and said with an indifferent expression, "Don't touch me so randomly." Livingston was deeply fascinated, and he was not willing to stop. How could he? Although he had stopped touching Saul, he still walked around the artificial body, conducting a visual inspection. Saul could only look at Zen for help in exasperation. He couldn't understand why Zen had brought this strange man here. Zen could only shrug his shoulders helplessly and explain, "He is a weapon refiner." According to him, he was the best weapon refiner of the last round of heavens. He has survived the end of the previous round of heavens. Saul's indifferent facade showed a slight hint of surprise. Then he looked at Livingston and remarked, "It's not bad." With limited resources available, he was able to construct such a puppet body for himself. Although the appearance is a little crude and ugly, he has displayed the characteristics of these trashy materials to the limit. Saul's perfect puppet body was certainly not something that Livingston could compare to. The materials used in Saul's construction were unfathomable to Livingston, because he had never seen them before. Materials and technologies had changed greatly with the passage of time. Saul had lived for so many years, and he had followed his master for many years, so he had developed a good eye. He had taken a dislike to the materials from which Livingston was made. These trashy materials had produced an ugly and strange puppet body, which meant that Livingston must be a truly talented weapon refiner to have made something that lasted this long, while using scraps. "Trash. You said I used trashy materials." Livingston was unwilling to accept this. Back then, in order to obtain these materials, Osborne had gone out of his way. How could Saul say they were trash? However, on second thought, Livingston felt discouraged. Not wanting to dwell on the insults, he directed his attention back to the fairy palace instead. Light piece sand had been used to bake the bricks that were used to build the walls, and the Emperor Vigor stones were used to pave the floors. Livingston realized then that if he had been the owner of the fairy palace, he would also have thought that the materials he had used were trash, especially when compared to such opulence. Saul didn't ask Zen why he had returned to the fairy palace. He was merely a servant left behind by his master to serve Zen. He would do his best to help Zen in governing the fairy palace and settling into it. The purpose of Zen's return to the fairy palace this time was to place Freya and Livingston in it. Freya was becoming more and more curious as she traveled along the walkways through the fairy palace. The fairy palace was not a place that she could easily understand, but she also understood now why Zen had been so confident before. It would be very difficult for outsiders to invade such a fairy palace, right? It was a magnificent place of mysteries and marvel. Livingston was at the back of the little group. Soon he had already become somewhat numb. In his eyes, every kind of material that had been used to build the fairy palace was a precious treasure. He couldn't wait to plunder the pavilions, the railings and the floor tiles. Livingston almost trembled at the thought of everything that he could make with this wealth of materials at his disposal. However, after seeing so much, he finally seemed to slump into a haze of befuddlement. Just as he passed by the pavilion in the center of the pond, his eyes became fixated in that direction. There were several passages connected to the pavilion, and each passage led to a different hall. Among them were the library, the pill refining workshop, and the weapon refining workshop, magical places all. The weapon refining workshop. Livingston recalled that Zen had said that he would help him settle down in a weapon refining workshop. Was this to be his workshop? As a puppet, Livingston didn't have a heart. If he had one, his heart would probably have started beating crazily at this very moment, at the mere sight of the weapon refining workshop. The fairy palace was amazing, so the weapon refining workshop definitely seemed to be extraordinary. There were a multitude of tools and materials carefully stored in the workshop, and Livingston eagerly feasted his eyes on the sight which tempted him so much. Clank, Clank. With that thought in mind, Livingston's pace quickened as he charged on his wobbly legs toward the weapon refining workshop, hoping to explore the hidden secrets within. Halfway into the workshop, with a tremendous crash, Livingston hit a transparent enchanted barrier that had suddenly materialized. He hit the ground hard, sat up for a moment and then lay back on the ground, motionless. Upon witnessing this scene, Saul was left speechless. Has he used up his life vitality crystals? Earlier, Saul had noticed that the energy used to drive Livingston's puppet body was extremely inferior. He was actually driven by life vitality. If one wanted to control him, he or she would have to spend a massive amount of life vitality. It would be a costly exercise to keep the ancient puppet running. Zen smiled wryly at Saul. As he walked up to the Livingston, he heard Livingston's nearly inaudible cry. Then he once again took out life vitality jades, supported Livingston up into a sitting position, and slotted the life vitality jades into the groove on his back. Very soon, Livingston was able to move again. Immediately after he recovered, he said, "Why can't I go in the workshop?" Zen shrugged his shoulders and shook his head. "The reason is simple, I don't have the right to enter it, so neither do you." Ah! Livingston let out a miserable cry and leaned back against the invisible barrier. He eagerly looked at the workshop, which was just out of reach, wanting to open a hole on the door. "How can I get in?" "It depends on luck," Zen answered. Zen would definitely push his way through the true path. After all, he only had 3 tokens with him. However, he wasn't too sure if he could obtain the token to open the weapon refining workshop, so he didn't make Livingston any promises. Livingston was very disappointed as there was clearly no hope for him to enter the workshop. He clambered to his feet to follow Zen in leaving, but turned to look back repeatedly with every reluctant step. He kept saying, "It depends on luck. What kind of luck will it take to open the workshop?" Saul, who was leading the way, calmly said, "With your lowly weapon refining skills, even if you manage to open the workshop, you still won't be qualified to control it." "How is that possible?" Livingston, after years of believing that he was the best weapon refiner, was not convinced by Saul's doubt. People could doubt everything about him, like his life, but he absolutely would not allow them to doubt his weapon refining skills. He had intentionally turned himself into an ugly puppet just to survive in the world and study his refining skills. How could people doubt him without even knowing all that he had survived? Saul smiled faintly. He pointed at the library and said in a conciliatory tone, "My master's library contains a myriad of things, including many books on weapon refining. You are free to read them." Chapter 1154. Preparations. Livingston still wasn't convinced even as he followed Zen into the library. Now that they were in this fairy palace, Zen wanted to help Freya and Livingston settle down into the fairy palace. He also advised Freya to look around and pick out a book that might help her cultivate. Her original cultivation method was derived from the great world she had originally come from. Livingston was in awe at the sight of so many books before him. He effectively ignored those on cultivation methods since they would be useless for his current puppet body. What piqued his interest were the numerous texts on weapon refining, so much so that he even refused to leave after entering the library, too engrossed with his reading. Once the two were settled, Zen immediately departed and, with a gentle tap of his hand, shrank the majestic fairy palace back into the palm-sized token in his hand. The reincarnation plate was in tatters, but it wouldn't be destroyed so easily in such a short period of time. Zen was confident that if Alina's subjects launched an attack, then all he would need to do was to step back inside the fairy palace. However, catching him at this point in time was unlikely since they would need to destroy the reincarnation plate first. Once done with his preparations, Zen once again controlled the reincarnation plate and flew straight through the sky to roam around and explore the universe. In the Demon Knight's core supreme world, the punishment world. This supreme world structure was incredibly unique owing to the fact that it was entirely made up of one huge mountain. This mountain was aptly named Punishment Mountain, with its foot starting just at the edge of the world and extending all the way to the center. Of course, the residents of this world couldn't really feel like they were living in a mountain, because this mountain was just too huge. The only way one would be able to discern the form of the landmass was if they looked at it from a distance in space. The Heavenly Punishment Palace stood like a beacon on the mountain world. Today, numerous Demon Knight warriors gathered at its gate. These warriors, both men and women, that had gathered here were elders of the Demon Knight who had lived for millions of years. A few had even undergone the 5 aging processes already. They were mostly weathering away as they waited for death to consume them. There was no longer any possibility of extending their lifespans since they were mere world lords that could never attain immortality. "Let Elena out. We want an explanation. She has to explain what she did to the Board of Elders." We can't let her mess things up anymore. The Board of Elders was an important fixture to the Demon Knight. Aside from the 3 queens, it was these elders who decided upon the internal matters of the race. The 3 queens already had their hands full of responsibilities. Elena was in charge of punishment, Lavender of killing, and the Queen of Life was in charge of the continuation of their race. Thus, the affairs of handling the administrative workings of Demon Knight were delegated to the Board of Elders, making them extremely important to the race. Elena and Lavender's battle had begun 700 years ago. Killing a queen was an unimaginable thing to the Demon Knight. It was the sort of crime whose punishment could never offset the deed. However, the Board of Elders had all said nothing when Elena made her move so many years ago. After all, what could they do if the one who wanted to kill the queen was another queen? The Board of Elders had chosen to remain silent after it had become apparent that Lavender was going to die. After her death, all of them were unwilling to speak out against Elena and chose to quietly wait for a new queen to come instead. 700 years. They waited 700 years for their new queen. No queen ever came though because there was no need for a replacement. Lavender did not die and she even managed to return. The recovery of Lavender's soul caused a ripple across the Board of Elders. They knew the old queen had the power to return but that did not ensure her success. They all had to wait and see what would happen. However, Elena was not willing to idly sit by. She quickly dispatched Vivica, Elspeth, Salvador, and Anisha to kill Lavender, which elevated the ripple into violent, crashing waves. Her actions had driven the Board of Elders into a frenzy. It wasn't the first time Elena had done something that caused dissatisfaction across the board, but her attempted re-assassination of Lavender was the final straw. They knew they could no longer allow her to continue lest their entire race collapse. And so the Board of Elders decided to act. More than 20 of them gathered at the gate of Elena's heavenly punishment palace. However, the palace gates remained closed. They had waited there for around 14 hours now and some of the elders were already airing out their grievances. Some had even begun shouting and berating the guards. Our queen is still sleeping. Please return another time, Enzo, the silver-haired guard, announced with a faint smile. Do you take us as fools? I am more than 100 times older than you. I was not born yesterday. Get Elena out here immediately. The Board of Elders is not a puppet. Lavender is not a traitor. How could Elena treat her in such a manner? If Elena does not come out of her palace and explain herself, then we will not hesitate to impeach her. Enzo sneered at the elders. Words, impeach her. You must be joking. It was true that the Board of Elders had the right to impeach queens and appoint new ones in paper. However, there had never been a need to exercise such a right. A Demon Knight queen's influence ran deep after all. Those in the upper management had more insight into the conflicts that happened at the top, but the majority of the race blindly worshipped their queens with devotion. They served as the Demon Knight's spiritual symbols after all, far higher than the Board of Elders. Therefore, the threat of impeachment had no teeth against Elena. The elders continued to protest loudly in front of the gate, annoying Enzo greatly. He was doing his best to restrain the killing intent in his heart with all the whining these old fools were doing. These old fools were all world lords, after all, and a few of them had once been grand world lords. They once served as the Demon Knight's backbone but were now simply waiting for death to claim them after living in this world for too long. They were no longer the formidable pillars they had once been in their prime. Time had come and eroded the strength they once had in their bodies. Still, the prestige and respect they carried were no joke. These old warriors represented the 72 major clans of their race. If Enzo killed one of them, it was possible that he would unknowingly start a domino of unnecessary trouble. He had to deal with them here in a peaceful manner, for Elena's sake. He knew these old fools would never dare to charge into the heavenly punishment palace forcefully. In the midst of the protest, a silhouette quietly appeared in the center of the palace. This newcomer was a tall man clad in a long, plain robe held together by a python-patterned jade belt. My queen, he addressed Elena but did not bow to her. Elena smiled at him cordially atop her throne. Gunter, what's wrong? She asked the Demon Knight Supreme Lord. There weren't a lot of Supreme Lords in their race. They only had 4 so far. This was taking into account the hundreds of Supreme Worlds and countless sacred places that the Demon Knight occupied. Supreme Lord Leroy was able to obtain the Crown of Destiny with the help of Lavender and her clansmen. This did not mean that the Demon Knight was weak, but only 128 creatures were given the privilege to bear the heavenly destiny. No matter how gifted a newcomer was, he or she could not ascend the role if all positions had been filled up. It did not matter how talented warriors were. Without the Crown of Destiny, they would never be able to break through. Supreme Lord Gunter was one of Elena's supporters and his presence here made her nervous. Did he come here for the exact same reason those elders that currently protested at her gates had? Was he here to dissuade her? That might be troublesome if that was the case. Supreme Lord Gunter's suggestion would be something she could not set aside so easily. However, his next words made her heave a sigh of relief. The heavens trembled, he said. The heavens trembled, Elena repeated, and a trace of ruthlessness appeared on her exquisite face. She was not a Supreme Lord and did not bear the heavenly destiny, so she could not feel the vibration of the heavens. Chapter 1155, Abolish. When one heard the word heavens, it was often associated with grace, strength, and the ability to sustain a whole grand era. Generally speaking, the current round of heavens was quite stable. If something interrupted this stability, great consequences definitely awaited. Most of the time, it included the fall of a Supreme Lord and the reappearance of the Crown of Destiny. There were only 128 Supreme Lords in the whole universe, and all of them had extremely long lifespans. And while a Supreme Lord's death was a rare thing, it was also a great opportunity for all races. The Supreme Lords were so few that even a large race like the Demon Knight race only had 4 Supreme Lords. Thus, it was considered highly important to have another Supreme Lord. Now, not all 4 of the Demon Knight race's Supreme Lords supported Elena. Although Supreme Lord Gunter was one of her strong supporters, Supreme Lord Leroy had always stayed hidden and was always a steady supporter of Lavender. As for the other 2 Supreme Lords, one of them stood by the Queen of Life, while the last one remained neutral but occasionally followed the Board of Elders' commands. If Elena could obtain another Crown of Destiny, the Demon Knight race would have the 5th Supreme Lord who would give her his or her unwavering support. This way, her dominance would further be strengthened. The heavens just trembled. Did a Supreme Lord die? Elena asked, her eyes alight with a beautiful blue sparkle. Gunter shook his head respectfully in response. No, my queen, all the Supreme Lords are still alive, he answered. No, are you sure? Elena cocked one fine brow. She was surprised by his answer, so she asked, then what caused the heavens to shake? Gunter's face held a trace of doubt. He hesitated for a moment, but continued, although no Supreme Lord has died, I can feel that there is an extra heavenly destiny. An extra heavenly destiny, Elena repeated, apparently taken aback by his statement. How is it possible? I've never heard of such a thing. A round of heavens only settled 128 heavenly destinies for the Supreme Lords to bear. This was common knowledge in the entire universe, and was also regarded as an unbreakable law. Thus, Elena was confused after she heard what Gunter had said. I don't know why, either, Gunter said and shook his head. He had no idea what would happen if someone had forcibly carried the extra heavenly destiny, but the Crown of Destiny was something they had to fight for no matter what. Anyway, I have already figured out the location of this Crown of Destiny, he added. Where is it? Elena asked eagerly. It's in the Dark World, Gunter said. However, it has been constantly changing its position since the day before yesterday. It seems that it has already flown into the deep space, headed towards the northern sky region, he added. A hint of curiosity flashed in Elena's eyes. Then, she suddenly burst into a fit of laughter. My queen, Gunter asked with apprehension. He was sure that he didn't say anything funny, so he didn't know why she was laughing. Lavender was in the Dark World several days ago. I sent my people to chase her, and she is now in the deep space and heading towards the northern sky region. This couldn't be coincidence, could it? Elena grinned. I didn't know about this. Gunter exclaimed with surprise. He thought that it made sense, but he did not calculate Zen and Lavender's positions anyway. Although the Supreme Lords carried the heavenly destinies, they still couldn't calculate everything. If they wanted to calculate any living being's position without using any relevant information, it was only possible if it was located in the same Supreme World. Other than that, anyone beyond that distance was out of their calculation reach. Despite that, calculating the position of the Crown of Destiny wasn't difficult for them. In fact, whenever a Supreme Lord died and the Crown of Destiny reappeared somewhere in the 100,000 Supreme Worlds right after, the other Supreme Lords calculated its position and sent their people to capture it. It seems that the odds are in our favor. We must hurry up so we don't waste this chance, Elena said excitedly as she stood up from her throne. Her several feet long azure skirt trailed along the steps as she quickly walked towards the palace entrance, with Gunter in tow. Everyone wanted the Crown of Destiny so badly. Gunter wasn't the only one who could figure out its location, as other Supreme Lords could do it as well. The Crown of Destiny was so coveted that every time it appeared, all the races fought fiercely over it. Some races had been lucky enough to see the Crown of Destiny appear right in their sacred place. If a warrior at the World Lord's level had captured it, he or she would become the new Supreme Lord. However, it wasn't a really good thing for weak races. It was because the Supreme Lords who had just carried the heavenly destiny ended up quite weak. Furthermore, their strengths differed greatly from each other. For instance, a Supreme Lord born from a small race would often be killed by Supreme Lords from other races. After that, the crown of destiny would disappear, then reappear in another place in the universe. There had once been a time when the crown of destiny had appeared at extremely unlucky locations for 7 consecutive times. It had appeared in the sacred places of some small races, and as a result, 7 new Supreme Lords were killed in succession. These 7 unlucky Supreme Lords had died for the same crown of destiny. Many of the world lords saw this crown as a truly fatal temptation, the smiling death. In the end, that crown of destiny ended up in the hands of a small race. That race's world lord knew that even if he carried the heavenly destiny, he would die quickly without the other Supreme Lord's protection. After some consideration, he had finally decided to give up the crown of destiny and let the other bigger races fight for it among themselves. The very first thing Gunter did after knowing the crown's location was to meet Elena. He wanted to inform her of the matter and hoped her to participate in the fight for the crown of destiny as soon as possible. It was a coincidence that Lavender actually had the crown of destiny. Moreover, Elena had already sent people to kill her. And now, the Demon Knight race had clearly seized the initiative this time. Click, click, click. As the silk of Elena's skirt glided towards the tiled hall of the Heavenly Punishment Palace's main entrance, the doors automatically opened. The group of old fellows from the Board of Elders had been waiting for quite a while now. When Elena arrived, all their eyes were trained on her. Among them was Enzo, who was surprised when he saw Elena had walked out of her palace. He whispered, "My queen." "Elena," an elder chimed in, "are you going to listen to our words? You shouldn't ignore the Board of Elders. A fight between 2 queens is something against the ancestors' wills. No matter how great your hatred is, you just can't do it. If you set a precedent for this, the 3 queens of the Demon Knight race will no longer remain as a whole, and I'm afraid that our race will no longer prosper." Elena wasn't really respected among the elders. Although the queens were above everyone else, these old elders had 1,000,000 years or even up to 10 million years worth of lifespan. They had seen many queens come and go. Moreover, the elders had the right to advise the queens. Elena waved her hand. Her eyes swept over the elders before she said in an aloof voice, "I don't have the time to listen to your nonsense." "Nonsense? You? How dare you call our advice as nonsense? Do you mean the Board of Elders is of no use to you?" A cold smile graced Elena's face as a faint, blue light flashed from within her body. Her perfectly sculpted face looked unabashedly hostile as she said, "Indeed, the Board of Elders is no longer of any use to me. If you don't mind, I will just abolish it." "Abolish? How dare you?" Elena's words were like a giant stone thrown into a very quiet lake, and caused a ripple of an uproar among the elders. The head of the Board of Elders was an old man who had lived for over 8 million years. He jumped up and pointed accusingly at Elena's face as he scolded, "Back then, we shouldn't have helped you get to the top. How could you do this to us?" Meanwhile, Enzo frowned and decided to step forward and stand in front of Elena. Even if this old man was the head of the Board of Elders, offending the queen in such a way would still be regarded as an outrageous act. Still, it would be troublesome for them if he insisted on his seniority. On the other hand, Elena remained stoic as ever. "Gunter," she said in her iciest tone. Behind her, Gunter quietly walked forward and looked the head of the Board of Elders in the eye. The old man froze for a moment and seemed to have thought of something. Suddenly, his eyes widened as he shouted in anger, "Gunter! How dare you? You can't." Before Gunter had become a Supreme Lord, he had also been a member of the Board of Elders. When the Demon Knight race had obtained a crown of destiny back then, they had decided to choose a member of Board of Elders to bear the heavenly destiny. It was the head who had recommended Gunter for the job. Never had he expected that millions of years later, he would actually die in Gunter's hands. Thump, there were no demonstrations of power, no gruesome fights, and no flows of life vitality. The head of the Board of Elders, a Demon Knight warrior and also a Grand World Lord, fell to the ground with a loud thud. All it took for death to claim him was a single glance from a Supreme Lord. Chapter 1156, Riddled with Holes. Looking in horror as the old man fell to the ground, everyone from the Board of Elders seemed like they had just been hit by a truck. Never in their wildest dreams would they have thought that Elena would actually have the guts to put them down, let alone their leader. "If you insist on continuing with this nonsense of yours, I don't give a rat's rear about killing each and every single of you." After stating that, Elena went ahead and took Enzo as well as Supreme Lord Gunter away. In any case, she just couldn't afford to waste her precious time on these over-the-hill fellows of the Board of Elders. At first, she actually intended to have a bit of fun in this game of cat and mouse between her and Lavender. That being said, in the case of Crown of Destiny, she was fully cognizant of the fact that it was about time for the game to reach its conclusion. Enzo, tell Maddox and Tanya to finish the job without delay. And as for the Crown of Destiny, if they happen to locate it, then bring it back to me right away. Elena gave out her order. Crown of Destiny. Enzo was in a state of shock, with his eyes completely glued to Supreme Lord Gunter. Supreme Lord Gunter simply nodded his head to reaffirm it. A Crown of Destiny has suddenly appeared. There's a good chance that it's with Lavender. I see. Enzo had always been quick on the uptake, so there was no need for them to say anything more. Meanwhile, in a star in the universe, there was a storm raging incessantly within the star. From afar, it was much like a scar on the surface of the star, stretching out for millions of miles. Little by little, it moved around on the star's surface. In truth, this storm was actually a fusion of thunder and fire. What was more, it had not faltered at all for a million years. Under such extreme conditions, not a living being could ever hope to pull through. Be that as it might, there was one person who was sitting in the very eye of the storm. With his arms outstretched, he had been continuously making calculations using his fingers. Not here. Upon making that statement, he proceeded to raise his hand once more and carried on with his calculations. His mind was completely engrossed in finding something. Not here either. Then, he simply started calculating again. And before one could say, "Knife," that person opened his eyes, revealing a radiant glow that was like that of the stars. I've done it. Ha ha, it's making its way to me. This Crown of Destiny, it's destined to be in my hands. When he was done speaking, his silhouette vanished into the massive storm. At that exact same time, the storm started to die down bit by bit. In the vast universe, a great many Supreme Lords had been trying to calculate the current position of the Crown of Destiny. For each of those Supreme Lords, their methods of calculating it might have varied, but all of them were perfectly capable of figuring out the location of the Crown of Destiny. This could only indicate that they had all locked onto Zen's whereabouts and were already starting to adopt measures. This was something that even Zen himself was not able to foresee. Indeed, he had a lot of faith in his fairy palace. However, that was just when he was holding his ground against Elena. If Supreme Lords were to actually come to him personally, there was no telling what could happen. Unfortunately for Zen, he was totally oblivious of the fact that his location had already been figured out by a number of Supreme Lords. At the moment, he still had his hands full with operating the fractured reincarnation plate and moving through the deep space heading north. There was an innumerable amount of stars in the universe. In a supreme world, if a man was to look up at the stars in the heavens, he might think that the distance between them was not that far. But after personally journeying into the deep space, he would start to think otherwise and comprehend the actual distance. The reincarnation plate was moving at intense speed. At the rate that it was moving, even if Zen were to unleash his maximum speed, it was highly unlikely that he would be able to reach so much as 1/100th of its current speed. In spite of that, even though he had already been flying for a full month, he had only moved a small distance in the deep space. Meaning to say, he was still a long way from the northern sky region. The key was that there was no space channel in the deep space, and the distance between one star to the next was unthinkably great. Only warriors who cultivated in spatial transference were capable of moving around freely within it. Apart from that, because of the spatial transference's complex principles, only those at the level of World Lord or higher could actually cultivate it. With that in mind, Zen continued making the reincarnation plate head north and began to cultivate as well. In that span of time, a small vortex started taking shape right in the middle of the chaotic sea within Zen's inner world. Ever since the moment the World Tree Seed entered his elixir field, it had been gradually absorbing his chaotic energy without stopping. At present, Zen had already managed to establish a connection with the seed. And he could tell that right after absorbing the chaotic energy, the seed had somehow transformed it into a special kind of energy. The new energy didn't seem to be life vitality, nor was it the pure law power. As for what it truly was, even Zen found it hard to tell. The truth was that he had actually asked the Cyan Dragon as well as Lavender about this before, but the two of them were totally in the dark. To be fair, the chaotic energy was related to something they could not comprehend. In the beginning, the Cyan Dragon actually had misgivings whether the tree seed would be able to hold out against the chaotic energy and successfully take root in Zen's body. The results proved that he had been worrying over nothing. Despite that, Zen was now having some strange reactions, and it was something he had to make sense of by himself. After 1.5 months had passed. Boom! Without a warning, the enormous reincarnation plate began to tremble violently. At this moment, Zen immediately opened his eyes and thought, "They're here." As soon as he got to his feet, his eyes swept the area around the reincarnation plate. It wasn't long before he saw a man and a woman from the Demon Knight standing in front of the reincarnation plate. The strength that these two possess probably isn't much too different from that of Vivica, Elspeth, Salvador, and Anisha. Furrowing his eyebrows just a tad bit, Zen knew that he was still far too weak. In the state that he was currently in, putting up a resistance against these strong people was definitely out of the question. This was all because Lavender had gotten exposed much too soon. Zen didn't really have enough time to bump up his strength whatsoever. And right now, he was about to be backed into a corner by such powerful enemies. No amount of talent would ever be able to help him hold his ground against these mighty world lords in just a short amount of time. Whoosh! In spite of sustaining a rather severe blow from the other party, the reincarnation plate was showing no signs of stopping at all. On the contrary, Zen was actually dead set on still making his way through the deep space. "Our queen told us to go all out. First, we're going to tear this reincarnation plate apart, and then we'll end that boy's life, and finally, we'll take away the crown of destiny as well," the woman from the Demon Knight said, sounding as though it was just nothing. A faint smile crept onto the face of the man wearing a long robe. "This is going to be a cakewalk. Just you watch." Immediately after he was done talking, a light purple crystal sword materialized in his hand. Starting off as just a light shaking, the crystal sword started vibrating uncontrollably. Buzz, buzz, buzz. In just a blink of an eye, the crystal sword split into 2, and then 2 split into 4, and the 4 into 8. In just a span of 5 minutes, through this fission process, a countless number of crystal swords had filled the space above the reincarnation plate. Spirit Crystal Rain. The moment the male Demon Knight member's voice drifted away, all of the crystal swords floating above plunged straight toward the reincarnation plate one after the other. PFF'd. It was hard to say where these crystal swords really came from. Even the exceedingly durable outer shell wasn't able to withstand the penetrating power of these crystal swords. The first crystal sword penetrated the plate with ease, leaving a bowl-sized opening on its surface. After that, the second one followed suit, then the third one, the fourth one. It appeared that there was no stopping that attack whatsoever. PFFT 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 PFFT. To put it simply, these crystal swords were much like a relentless rainstorm. It didn't take too long before the whole reincarnation plate became riddled with holes. On top of that, after piercing right through the reincarnation plate, they actually managed to penetrate even the bottom of the plate as well as bounce back. After that vicious onslaught, the crystal swords shifted their direction, hurling once again into the reincarnation plate. PFF'd. And just like that, the reincarnation plate was now chock full of crystal swords. As Zen was seated at the bottom of the plate, a crystal sword pierced right through the palace and was coming straight at him. Because he was sitting on the ground, Zen went hell for leather in order to evade the crystal sword. All he could do was watch as the crystal sword disappeared into the ground, but after that, he simply moved back to his original position. He still persistently operated the reincarnation plate. Throughout all of that, the expression he had on his face never shifted, not even once. There was no doubt that this reincarnation plate was indeed such a high-grade space tool, but considering the current level of Zen's strength, there was no way for him to prevent it from receiving damage. The best he could do at this point was to just make the most of what was left by having it go as far as it possibly could. PFFT PFFT PFFT. While Zen was still preoccupied with maneuvering the reincarnation plate, another set of 10 or so crystal swords made their way into the palace. In response, Zen's figure flashed one more time as he went on and continued to concentrate on navigating the plate. As these crystal swords ceaselessly hurtled to and fro, the reincarnation plate had become perforated all over. "The time is now. Let me do it myself." At this point, the woman held a 10-foot-long saber parallel to ground behind her, and a cold light suddenly enveloped the blade. Chapter 1157. The Moving Fairy Palace. The two Demon Knight warriors were a man and a woman. The man was called Maddox, and the woman was called Tanya. They were Alina's most capable subordinates, and their strength was on par with Vivica, Anisha, Salvador, and Elspeth. However, since the two warriors had followed Elena all these years, the benefits they had obtained were naturally much greater than those of the latter four. The weapons in their hands were both supreme divine weapons. The crystal sword in Maddox's hand was called Infinite Crystal Sword. As long as he was strong enough, he would be able to turn the crystal sword into 2, then into 4. The stronger he was, the more crystal swords he would be able to divide. Each crystal sword would have the same power as the original one. On the Universe Spirit Tablet, the Infinite Crystal Sword was currently ranked the 2120th. As for the weapon in Tanya's hand, it was a machete called Slash. The machete's weapon refiner was a man with a very strange temperament. He had made only a few weapons, each of which was named with one word and was listed in the top 3000 in the Universe Spirit Tablet rankings. Moreover, every weapon also contained a law of causality. When Tanya waved the slash, the cold glint on the blade suddenly became so bright that no one could look at it. It was as if a star had been embedded on the surface of the machete. With a wave of the machete, Tanya sent forward an attack. Whoosh! The blade light spread out in the shape of a fan, making it seem as though a gigantic fan had appeared in the vast sky. Anything that came within the range of the light would be cut in half. The law of causality in Slash was very similar to that in the pickaxe named Black Star. However, the law of causality in Black Star was penetrating everything while that in Slash was cutting everything in half. Tanya had intentionally brandished the machete in such a way so as to cut the reincarnation plate into 2. However, when the fan-shaped light had extended enough to almost touch the reincarnation plate, the enormous plate suddenly rose to a higher altitude, dodging the attack in an extremely strange manner. In fact, Zen was the one who was controlling the reincarnation plate. He couldn't avoid the densely packed crystal swords, but he had the confidence to avoid the slowly spreading blade light. He was not an idiot who knew nothing but to run as fast as he could. Seeing the sight, Maddox couldn't help but laugh. The reincarnation plate was so large, yet Tanya had missed her target. It was indeed a joke. Tanya had never thought that the reincarnation plate would be able to dodge her attack even though it was riddled with holes. There was a hint of anger in her eyes as she snorted coldly. Then, she crazily swung Slash around in her hands. Whoosh, 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 the machete in her hands transformed into rings of light, followed by dozens of blade lights. With Tanya at the center, they spread out, and this time, the speed of the blade lights was 100 times faster. Moreover, some of these blade lights were vertical, some were horizontal, and some were slanted. There were no blind spots at all. Even Maddox had to step back to avoid being grazed by these blade lights. Crack, crack, a sound that could make anyone's headache echoed out from within the reincarnation plate. The blade lights were unstoppable and instantly cut the massive reincarnation plate into several pieces. Maybe it was because the blade lights were too sharp, the reincarnation plate kept flying forward out of inertia even after it had been cut into several pieces. However, a few more thin lines appeared on the surface of the plate. It flew like this for a period of time before the plate began to disintegrate bit by bit into giant, shapeless pieces that floated and rolled in the air. One of the gigantic fragments of the plate was slowly rotating in a spiral, and Zen had his feet firmly nailed to it. His entire body rolled along with the fragment, but his gaze was always directed at Maddox and Tanya. He even had a faint smile on his face. "This is the brat," Maddox announced, taking a look at Zen. "Lavender is his sword spirit, so she is within his body." "Kill him first," Tanya said coldly. In her eyes, this young man at the Soul Sea realm was only a novice who had just set foot on the road of cultivation. There was no need to waste words on him, and following Alina's orders would always be the first priority. But right at this moment, the token of mountain appeared in Zen's hand. Instantly, it transformed into a mini-sized fairy palace, and his figure disappeared from where he stood. Seeing this, Tanya was slightly stunned. There's another space tool. Space tools were not very common, so Tanya and Maddox hadn't expected Zen to have another small space treasure to hide in after the reincarnation plate was destroyed. "It is a waste of time," Tanya added quickly, shaking her head. Without any hesitation, she headed straight for the fairy palace. However, just as she was about to charge over, she saw that the fairy palace was flying forward at an extremely fast speed, faster than she could comprehend. How can this space treasure be so ridiculously fast? Maddox raised his eyebrows as well. It was obvious that the scene in front of him was nothing like anything he'd seen before. Both of them were top world lords. They were one of the few beings in this grand era that had an acute understanding of the space law. They just hadn't obtained any crown of destiny, otherwise, they could become supreme lords too. And yet, the tiny fairy palace was somehow several times faster than them. In the blink of an eye, there was a great distance between them and the fairy palace. No matter how fast you are, it's useless. Snorting again, Tanya swung her machete down, tearing apart space. With a single step, she crossed several hundred miles of space, accompanied by the space law power. Maddox did the same. With a single step forward, he teleported and stood right in front of the small fairy palace. The speed of the fairy palace was indeed extremely great, but in the end, it was still flying within space. Compared to the two of them who could cover hundreds of miles in just a single step, it was still a lot slower. Break apart. Seeing the fairy palace heading straight for her, Tanya swung straight at it. Whoosh! Not only was the small fairy palace extremely fast, but it was also agile. The fairy palace made a 90-degree turn in the air, avoiding the might of Slash. However, just when it managed to dodge the large blade, it was met with Maddox's crystal swords. The densely packed crystal swords poured down like beautiful but deadly rain. Surprisingly, the fairy palace maneuvered through the rain of swords without coming into contact with a single crystal sword. After escaping Tanya's and Maddox's interception, the fairy palace continued to fly away. The two warriors once again teleported through space to intercept it. They were growing increasingly impatient with Zen, who kept managing to slip through their fingers even after being chased and intercepted so many times. They had destroyed the huge reincarnation plate so easily that they had never thought that they would be unable to deal with the small fairy palace. The fact that there was nothing they could do about it was a great humiliation to them. Inside the fairy palace, Zen was standing on a square. Saul was standing behind him. In front of them was a crystal wall, and on the crystal wall was an image of the outside world. To be more accurate, what was outside the fairy palace was not a part of the universe at all, it was a place unknown to Zen. The real outside world had been blocked by the enchanted barrier that was being released from the fairy palace. The small fairy palace which was being pursued was nothing more than an illusory manifestation of the real fairy palace. It seems that we can't get rid of them. Zen looked at the image of the two demon knight warriors chasing after him on the crystal wall. Saul smiled slightly. Zen, there's no need to worry. These two have comprehended spatial transference, so the fairy palace can't flee by flying alone. However, we don't need to be afraid of mere world lords. Even if the fairy palace remained motionless, they wouldn't be able to break through it. Zen nodded. He still didn't know how to resolve this crisis, but at the very least, he was able to guarantee his own safety as well as Lavender's. Right now, all he could do was take one step at a time and see how long Elena could pester him like this. The chase lasted for about 2 days, and the distance between them and a bright yellow star in the middle sky region was getting closer and closer. This whole time, although Maddox and Tanya were pursuing them with all their might, they still couldn't do anything to this small fairy palace. However, just at this moment, a streak of black smoke appeared behind the two of them. As the black smoke rolled over, a giant hand reached out and grabbed at the two of them. Chapter 1158. The Gathering of Many Supreme Lords. Suddenly, a giant hand grabbed at Maddox and Tanya. Even with their abilities, they couldn't escape it. In the blink of an eye, they were caught in the grip of the giant hand. Tanya's face darkened, her machete and her body were tightly grasped in the huge hand. Slash unexpectedly released a circular light screen that continuously spread in an attempt to forcefully push the huge hand apart. Maddox also released his own power to try and break free from the giant hand. May I ask who you are? We are from the Demon Knight, and we are here to act on behalf of our queen. As Maddox struggled, Tanya revealed their identity. At this, a sneer came from the sky. So you're from the Demon Knight. You can scram now. After that, the giant hand gently pinched the light screen that Tanya had created, causing it to shatter with a loud bang. Then, it suddenly swung forward and threw the two of them into the air. A Supreme Lord's strength was unimaginably great. With just a gentle toss, Maddox and Tanya began to roll in the air. In the blink of an eye, they flew tens of thousands of miles before slowly coming to a stop. The two of them exchanged glances, frowning. Although their strength was extraordinary among the world lords, it was still too insignificant in the face of a Supreme Lord. The difference between a warrior that carried the heavenly destiny and a warrior that didn't was just too great. A warrior could only become a Supreme Lord if he or she possessed a crown of destiny and carried the heavenly destiny. What do we do now? Maddox asked. Our Queen and Supreme Lord Gunter must be rushing here at top speed right now. Even if this Supreme Lord snatched the crown of destiny, he wouldn't be able to take it away, Tanya said with a cold snort. It took a warrior a certain period of time to carry the heavenly destiny after he or she obtained a crown of destiny. Even if this Supreme Lord took away the crown of destiny and passed it on to a world lord beside him, that world lord wouldn't be able to carry the heavenly destiny in such a short period of time. Furthermore, during the process of carrying the heavenly destiny, a warrior had to communicate with the heavens without moving even a single step. If this Supreme Lord obtained the crown of destiny and immediately fled, he might be able to run away. However, other Supreme Lords would chase after him. Every time a crown of destiny appeared, many great races would fight for it. Maddox and Tanya felt rather frustrated right now. If Elena had sent them to kill Zen from the beginning instead of sending Salvador, Anisha, Vivica, and Elspeth, they might have already taken the crown of destiny and returned to their place. But now, the small fairy palace had flown quite far away and was heading straight for the nearest light yellow star. As the billowing black smoke dispersed, a tall and sturdy figure came into view. This guy was clad in black armor. His eyes were like bells, and his body was wide and broad. It was an impressive Ogre Supreme Lord. As the Ogre Supreme Lord looked at the small fairy palace that was fleeing far away, his face revealed a faintly discernible sneer. The billowing black smoke once again enveloped his entire body, and he chased after the fairy palace at an even faster speed. Standing inside the fairy palace, Zen watched the events in the outside world as the pale yellow star grew bigger and bigger in his eyes. Mountains, rivers, deserts. Every single detail on this star was clearly visible to Zen. 90% of the surface of this star was covered by sand, and there were no living beings on it. Some of the stars were home to living beings, even a few large stars were occupied by the races in the universe. There were also some extremely special minerals and resources on these stars that were impossible to find within the Supreme Worlds. The small fairy palace charged straight toward the surface of this star. At Zen's request, it drilled into a desert. Zen had watched as the two demon knight warriors had battled the giant black hand before being flung away. Although he didn't have to worry about the two demon knight warriors anymore, he now had a bigger worry. Since the giant hand had been able to easily grab two world lords and casually fling them afar, it must mean that the owner of the giant hand was a Supreme Lord. I don't know which race you are from, brat, but all I want is the crown of destiny. If you hand it over, then you won't have to die. While Zen was deep in thought, he heard the voice of the Supreme Lord resound through the fairy palace. In the sky, a burly figure emerged from the black smoke, looking down at him like a giant god. With just a single glance from this Supreme Lord, Zen's heart began to beat wildly. It was as if there was a type of powerful energy contained within that gaze, and that was the supreme law under the heavens. So he is a Supreme Lord. And not just any Supreme Lord, but an Ogre Supreme Lord, Zen thought. Although he had heard of Supreme Lords before, this was the first time that he had seen a Supreme Lord in person. The number of Supreme Lords in this universe was far too low. Moreover, nearly all the Supreme Lords cultivated in seclusion and seldom showed themselves. He wants the crown of destiny. How does he know I have it? Zen wondered with a frown. He knew that some of the stronger warriors in the universe had calculation abilities. Even Immortal Mist from the lower world was proficient in purple star astrology and was able to calculate a person's fate. But it was hard for Zen to imagine that someone could be able to pinpoint the position of a tiny crown of destiny among 100,000 Supreme Worlds in the vast universe. This was a bit inconceivable, as Supreme Lords weren't gods, nor were they an omniscient existence. Zen naturally did not know that the crown of destiny was originally connected to the heavens. His unintentional contact with the crown of destiny had alerted all the Supreme Lords in the universe. When the Ogre Supreme Lord saw that the warrior in the mini-fairy palace did not respond, a sinister smile appeared on his face. The black smoke once again turned into a giant hand that enveloped the area below. However, just then, strange blue threads suddenly appeared in the sky. These threads interwoved and formed a huge and dense net, blocking the view of the Ogre Supreme Lord. When the Ogre Supreme Lord saw the blue net, his eyes flashed with a cold light. He waved his giant hand in an attempt to break through the net. Under his control, the power of the massive hand suddenly increased by more than 10 times. That blue net seemed to be unable to withstand the pressure, its threads broke off one after another, and the entire net was about to collapse. However, at this time, another blue net formed from threads appeared above the head of the Ogre Supreme Lord, enveloping him. The Ogre Supreme Lord noticed this net at the last minute and quickly withdrew his hand. His body flashed and turned into black smoke to avoid the net. Xania, you are simply courting death, he said in a cold voice. As the Ogre Supreme Lord finished speaking, the blue threads intertwined and gradually formed a beautiful and exquisite figure in the air. In an instant, the threads turned into a young and beautiful human girl. With a slight smile on her face, she stared at the Ogre Supreme Lord. Hi, Addison, I'm just looking for the crown of destiny. There's no need to get so worked up. Supreme Lord Xania had a frivolous smile on her face as she stared at the Ogre Supreme Lord. The Ogre Supreme Lord was the famous Supreme Lord Addison. He was considered one of the oldest and most famous Supreme Lords in the universe, and his lifespan could also be considered one of the longest. Another Supreme Lord. Inside the fairy palace, Zen's expression once again sank. The sudden appearance of two Supreme Lords was indeed beyond his expectations. Even though he was extremely confident in this fairy palace, facing two Supreme Lords was still hard to imagine. Right at this moment, a ball of purple flames suddenly burst out. The flames seemed to contain the might to burn the heavens. At once, a flash of scorching heat spread, causing the entire desert to turn into a blazing hell. Then, a figure walked out of the flames. I always thought I was fast, but I never thought that you two would be even faster. Ha ha. Another Supreme Lord, Zen exclaimed. His heart skipped a beat as a wry smile appeared on his face. The allure of the crown of destiny was actually this great. In the blink of an eye, it had attracted 3 Supreme Lords. He didn't know if there would be more Supreme Lords to come. Just as this thought appeared in Zen's mind, a 4th Supreme Lord slowly appeared in the sky. Chapter 1159, Elena arrived. The area spanning a 10th grade sacred place was already unimaginably large, and within a supreme world, there were only 2 or 3 World Lord level warriors. Ordinary warriors had very little chances of meeting a World Lord even once in their lifetimes. As for Supreme Lords, although they were scattered throughout the 100,000 Supreme Worlds, they were all legendary figures in the universe. From the moment a warrior stepped onto the path of cultivation, they broke through their limits step by step and became even more powerful. Once a warrior's cultivation reached a new realm, he or she would name the realm. The 5 levels of body refining: nature level, illuminating soul realm, internal elixir realm, virtual tribulation realm, life and death realm. After that, there were the soul sea realm, spirit supreme realm, and spirit transformation realm. Eventually, a warrior became a world lord. In theory, a world lord was the last realm warriors could reach. It was the end of the cultivation path warriors could reach with their talent and perseverance. It was impossible to walk farther with only those 2 aspects. If a warrior wanted to continue on that path, he or she would need a crown of destiny. Only by carrying the heavenly destiny would they be qualified to become Supreme Lords. There were only 128 Supreme Lords in the entire universe. 4 had already appeared before Zen. Zen was also a bit speechless at the moment. He knew that these Supreme Lords had come for his crown of destiny. It seemed that the crown was far more important than he had imagined. What was worse was that the number of Supreme Lords who appeared before him was still increasing. 5, 6, 7, buzz. At this moment, the sword spirit inside Zen's body manifested next to him. Lavender stood beside him and stared indifferently at the sky. Supreme Lord Gunter. She frowned. Supreme Lord Gunter. Zen's gaze was fixed on the 7th Supreme Lord. From his appearance, he was able to determine that the Supreme Lord was a Demon Knight member. However, he had not heard of him before. Since Supreme Lord Gunter has come, Elena would be here too, Lavender said flatly. Elena. When Zen heard this name, killing intent flashed through his mind. Zen had never wanted to kill someone as much as he wanted to kill Elena. Not even Eddie, who had been his great adversary. If Eddie had been willing to let Yan go, Zen would have let him go as well, even though he badly wanted to do away with him. However, this woman was an exception. Lavender still looked at the sky as a deep blue light appeared there. At the front of the light was a person wearing the Saint Sky armor and slowly approaching them, the Saint Thunder Meteor hammer in her hands. The woman was one of the 3 queens of the Demon Knight race, the Queen of Punishment. Zen had seen Elena's statues more than once before. He had even broken her statues several times, but this was the first time he had come face to face with her true appearance. As the saying went, fine feathers make fine birds. The Saint Sky armor was special as it was made according to Elena's figure. It made her chest look plumper and her waist look more slender. Beneath the bottom of the armor, her legs were slim and athletic. She was like a demure and composed goddess. Zen had to admit that Elena was indeed an almost perfect woman, but on her beautiful face, there was an almost violent and malicious sneer. Under normal circumstances, the queens of the Demon Knight would only be at the World Lord level. After all, none of the 3 queens carried the heavenly destiny. But at the moment, a bright blue ray of light shone behind Elena. This ray of light was the pool of faith of the Demon Knight which belonged to her. The pool of faith continuously replenished her faith energy. It was her fighting state. It was due to the help of the pool that Elena was not inferior to any Supreme Lord present here. However, the strongest one of the 3 queens of the Demon Knight was, in fact, Lavender. After all, she was the Queen of Killings as well as the strongest weapon that the Demon Knight possessed. Next came Elena, and then the Queen of Life. Lavender was unable to use her pool of faith because Elena had sealed it up. However, previously when Lavender was able to extract the faith energy from it, she had still not been a match to a world lord. After all, she was in a rather poor condition right now and was unable to absorb the faith energy without restraint. As the Supreme Lords in the sky spotted Elena, they took several steps back, their faces revealing traces of fear. The Demon Knight only had 4 Supreme Lords, which was fewer than those of the humans and ogres. But the 3 queens were not weaker than the Supreme Lords and matched up to them in their own right. It was about the same as having 3 more Supreme Lords. Even though the Queen of Killings was nowhere to be found right now, the Queen of Punishment was not to be underestimated. Supreme Lords were divided into top rank, mid-rank, and low-rank individuals. They each had their own heavenly destiny. The laws of causality that they possessed were different, and thus their levels of strength were also different. The Supreme Lords who had just now appeared could be considered to be low rank. As for Elena, she was comparable to a mid-rank Supreme Lord. Elena sashayed and slowly tiptoed in the sky with a proud expression on her face. It was as if she did not take these Supreme Lords seriously at all. She straightaway headed toward the mini-fairy palace above the desert. These Supreme Lords were currently in a stalemate, and it would not be entirely surprising if they started a fight for the sake of the Crown of Destiny. But since they were all Supreme Lords, they were constantly weighing the pros and cons of their decisions. As of now, they maintained a delicate balance. No one wanted to snatch away the tiny fairy palace, for they were afraid that they would become the target of heavy public criticism. But when Elena stepped forward, it was as if nobody else was present. Supreme Lord Addison could not help but speak out to stop her. But just as Supreme Lord Addison opened his mouth, Supreme Lord Gunter's ghost-like figure floated over to Elena's side. He had an arrogant smile on his face as he stared at Supreme Lord Addison. "Addison, this is an internal matter of our Demon Knight race. Do you want to interfere?" "An internal matter? What a joke. When did the Crown of Destiny become the internal matter of the Demon Knight?" Supreme Lord Addison asked with anger. The ogres also had mid-rank and top-rank Supreme Lords. It was just that they had not made an appearance as of yet. Otherwise, he would have already taken action. The Demon Knight and the ogres never got along well. The two races had fought against each other in dozens of Supreme Worlds up until now. However, in race wars of this level, Supreme Lords rarely fought. Even if a Supreme World was occupied by the other force, it would be difficult to attract the attention of a Supreme Lord. After all, the Supreme Lords of every race were their trump cards. Once they participated in a normal level war, the shockwaves they created would no longer make the situation a trivial matter. The Queen of Killings of the Demon Knight is hiding in the Fairy Palace. Tell me, is this not an internal matter of the Demon Knight? Supreme Lord Gunter asked with a cold smile. The Queen of Killings, Lavender. Supreme Lord Addison frowned at once. Back then, Lavender had killed a Supreme Lord in order to help Leroy get a Crown of Destiny. Every Supreme Lord's death was an event that shook the heavens in this universe. Killing a Supreme Lord had far-reaching consequences and was tough to boot. Even a top-rank Supreme Lord did not have complete confidence that he or she could kill a low-rank one. However, Lavender had managed to do it. She was also the first World Lord to kill a Supreme Lord, even though she had relied on the faith energy of the Pool of Faith. They could not forget how it had happened. Since then, Lavender's name was remembered by each and every Supreme Lord. It was the Queen of Killings who had killed a Supreme Lord, with no heavenly destiny on her shoulders. Several hundred years ago, Lavender had suddenly vanished in the universe. Even though the Demon Knight members had tried their best to conceal this matter, the statues of the queens were spread throughout the various sacred places of the race. It was almost impossible to hide something so huge. To the Supreme Lords of other races, it was good news. Later on, they got to know that the two queens of Demon Knight were engaged in an internal conflict. Now, it seemed that this matter was true. The most powerful queen of the Demon Knight was hiding in this tiny fairy palace. Since she possessed the Crown of Destiny, why did she not try to carry the heavenly destiny? The Supreme Lords present were clearly suspicious. Elena did not pay any attention to the conjectures of the Supreme Lords. As she stopped a certain distance from the mini-fairy palace, a small smile bloomed across her mouth. Lavender, it's time to come out, don't you think? Lavender's gaze was fixed on Elena's face. She, who was usually so calm and indifferent, couldn't keep her cool anymore. Just as she was about to speak, Zen suddenly reached out and stopped her with a smile. Let me handle this jerk. Chapter 1160. Drag more Supreme Lords in. Right now, the Fairy Palace was Zen and Lavender's last shelter. If the Fairy Palace was destroyed, Zen would have no choice but to accept his fate. Now that he was facing so many Supreme Lords as well as Elena, he seemed to have fallen into a death trap. However, he didn't mind making the situation more complicated if it meant that he could find a way out. With that thought in mind, he took out the roaring token. A moment later, Zen's voice resounded throughout the entire universe. "Hi jerk, we meet again." When Elena heard Zen's words, a trace of anger blossomed in her icy gaze. "How dare he insult me?" she thought. As an exalted queen of the Demon Knight, how could she tolerate a mere Soul Sea Realm warrior humiliating her? However, her face was still calm. She said coldly, "In my eyes, you're just a nobody. A Soul Sea Realm warrior doesn't have the qualifications to even talk to me. Let Lavender out." Zen opened his mouth again. "Humph, in my eyes, you aren't even a queen of the Demon Knight. You're just a jerk. You want us to come out? Not a chance. Why don't you come in if you're powerful enough? There are many treasures in this fairy palace. Other than the Crown of Destiny, there is also my roaring token. This thing should be something that surpasses the heavens, right? It has limitless use." Zen's words shocked all the intelligent creatures in the 100,000 supreme worlds. A Soul Sea Realm warrior has a Crown of Destiny. According to the legends, a Crown of Destiny is what allows a world lord to become a supreme lord. But now, it has been obtained by a mere Soul Sea Realm warrior. If I have this Crown of Destiny, I can become a supreme lord. All around the universe, warriors at a low cultivation level just said whatever they pleased. The truth was, if this Crown of Destiny truly fell into their hands, it would just be a hot potato. They wouldn't gain anything out of it. In fact, they might even lose their lives. However, some of the world lords were immediately envious. Every supreme world in the universe had a world lord, with the exception of a few extremely barren and harsh supreme worlds. Some supreme worlds even had 2 to 3 world lord level warriors, such as the Dark World and the Spirit Reading World. When these world lords heard Zen's words, they immediately wanted to obtain this Crown of Destiny as well. They had already reached the peak of their cultivation path. The only way they could take a step further was to obtain a Crown of Destiny. They couldn't understand how it had been obtained by a mere Soul Sea Realm warrior. "Bring that Crown of Destiny here. I'll ask my grandpa to obtain the Crown of Destiny for me." Where is this brat now? Some ordinary world lords could do nothing about it, but there were other world lords who had powerful forces backing them. Some of them were even the children or personal disciples of supreme lords. Although 128 supreme lords had already known about the Crown of Destiny in Zen's possession, many of them hadn't been intending to take any action due to various reasons. But now that the news of the Crown of Destiny had spread throughout the entire universe to all races and all living beings, the situation had changed. The brat's roaring token can actually be used an infinite number of times. Isn't this too exaggerated? Who in the universe could create such a roaring token? I don't believe it. You have to believe it. Do you remember how many times this brat has already used the roaring token? Even supreme lords would not casually use a roaring token. It's too difficult to obtain one in the first place. Where did that brat get so many roaring tokens? Zen's mention of the roaring token had shaken the universe almost as much as his possession of the Crown of Destiny. A roaring token was something that even supreme lords had to pay attention to. Elena's frown deepened when she heard Zen's words. What is this guy trying to do? She thought. Zen put down the roaring token and turned to Lavender with a smile. What star is this? Lavender thought for a moment, and then said, "This is the 12th star in the middle sky region. I think it's called Yellow Sand Star." There were many stars in the sky, and although her memory was extraordinary, she wasn't too sure about her answer. Zen activated the roaring token once more and said, "This is truly an honor. On the Yellow Sand Star, the 12th star in the middle sky region, several supreme lords have gathered in front of me. I wonder if there will be even more supreme lords descending here. I'm honored to be able to witness so many supreme lords." When Zen spread these words to the entire universe through the roaring token, the expressions on the faces of the supreme lords on the Yellow Sand Star changed several times. This brat wants to drag more people in. He is trying to attract even more supreme lords. Haha, he's quite clever. No, he's too childish. This move is useless. The gazes of several supreme lords had traces of admiration while other supreme lords had expressions of disdain. In the eyes of these supreme lords, the young man hiding in the fairy palace was facing certain death today. They thought that the reason he was trying to attract even more supreme lords was because he wanted to complicate things and take the first opportunity he got to run away. Under normal circumstances, this move of Zen's might be useful. But there were several supreme lords here. No matter how complicated the situation became, Zen wouldn't be able to escape under their watchful eyes. Nevertheless, Zen had still made the move. Not only had he thrown out the bait, but he had also accurately exposed his position. In fact, exposing his location was just a superfluous move. After all, it wasn't difficult for any Supreme Lord to figure out the position of the Crown of Destiny. The key was that Zen had successfully let everyone know about the Crown of Destiny as well as the Roaring Token. Everyone in the universe would want to obtain those treasures. Most of the 128 Supreme Lords belonged to great races. There were only a very small number of strange Supreme Lords that were all alone and didn't belong to any great races at all. Before this, many of the Supreme Lords had maintained a wait-and-see attitude. Since they had already become Supreme Lords, they had no intention of fighting for Zen's Crown of Destiny. After all, there was great risk in doing so and almost nothing to gain from it. But now, they were faced with their own descendants and children begging them for help. Soon, some of the Supreme Lords that hadn't made a move yet began to head toward the Middle Sky region. This included even Supreme Lord Miles and Supreme Lord Immortal. These two Supreme Lords not only aimed for the Crown of Destiny, but also the Roaring Token. Both of them had been ridiculed by Zen using the Roaring Token. They had been confused about why this mysterious youth had so many Roaring Tokens. But now, they had heard Zen personally admitting that his Roaring Token was something that surpassed the heavens. They were both shocked and convinced. They had no desire to obtain the Crown of Destiny, but they wanted to obtain the Roaring Token no matter what. As a result, more and more Supreme Lords began to leave their own Supreme Worlds and head toward the Middle Sky region. It seems that I was wrong, Elena said with a cold smile. When she had just discovered Zen, she should have personally gone to the Dark World instead of dragging things out and sending people to exterminate him. That had wasted a large amount of time. If not for this, she would probably have taken away the Crown of Destiny and Lavender's life a long time ago. Now that Zen had disclosed his possession of the Crown of Destiny and the Roaring Token to attract even more Supreme Lords, the situation had become a little tricky. He could cut a deal with a top-ranked Supreme Lord and exchange the Crown of Destiny for a guarantee of his safety. Since the situation was complicated, it was beneficial for Zen. Because of this, Elena no longer had any hesitation. As the faith energy filled her body, the Saint Thunder meteor hammer in her hands began to emit over 10,000 bolts of lightning. Crack, 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 her attack was about to smash straight down upon the fairy palace. However, just as Elena made her move, Supreme Lord Addison's black smoke rapidly spread over. He had been the first Supreme Lord to arrive, and with his tyrannical personality of an ogre, how could he give up his prey? Dozens of giant hands made of black smoke grabbed at the fairy palace from different directions. However, just as Supreme Lord Addison moved, countless tiny shadows erupted from Supreme Lord Gunter's body. Each shadow was only the size of a palm, but they contained a unique law of causality that seemed to completely melt away anything that touched them. The black smoke hands of Supreme Lord Addison were no exception. In the blink of an eye, they had completely melted away. However, even though Supreme Lord Gunter had blocked one of the Supreme Lords, he was unable to stop the remaining 5 Supreme Lords. All of them came over at almost the same time. They couldn't stand aside and let someone else take the Crown of Destiny.